there exists a photograph from 1895 that most people have never seen. In it, 6 men stand at the edge of a freshly opened burial mound somewhere in the American Midwest. Their faces carry an expression that's difficult to name or not. Quite fear, not quite wonder, but something suspended between the two. They're looking at the camera as if asking for confirmation of what lies at their feet. What lies at their feet shouldn't exist. The skeletal remains stretch across the excavation site in proportions that defy comfortable explanation. A femur bone rests against a shovel for scale, and the shovel loses. The sculler, what's left of it, sits partially embedded in clay soil, its dimensions suggesting something considerably larger than any human head should be. The workers have positioned themselves deliberately, standing beside the bones as living rulers, and the mathematics of the image becomes inescapable. If those men average 5.5 feet tall, then what they've unearthed stood somewhere between 8 and 10 feet when it walked the earth. The back of the photograph bears a notation in faded ink, County Archaeological Survey, Mound Site 17, September 1895. Nothing more. No names. No follow-up report. No museum catalogue number. This photograph survived. Thousands like it have surfaced over the years in newspaper archives, private estate sales, and forgotten museum storage rooms. They span decades, continents, and cultures. Each one tells a similar story without speaking. Something was found, something was documented, and then something was forgotten with remarkable consistency. We're taught to trust what endures in museums and textbooks. We assume that significant discoveries make their way into public knowledge, that revolutionary evidence reshapes our understanding of the past. But this photograph, and the countless others like it, exist in a strange territory between validation and dismissal. They're real enough to hold, detailed enough to study, yet absent from every official narrative about human history. The question isn't whether the photograph is authentic or fabricated. The question is why we're still asking. Why, more than a century later, does this image and others like it circulate in the margins of acceptable discourse? Why do certain discoveries seem to vanish despite documentation? And perhaps most unsettling, who benefits from the silence? This isn't a story about proving something existed. It's about understanding why the question refuses to die. The photograph from 1895 wasn't alone. It had company, an uncomfortable amount of it. On December 20, 1897, the Wisconsin Decatur Republican ran a story under the headline, "Bones of Prehistoric Giant Found Near Maple Creek." The article described the excavation of a burial mound that yielded skeletal remains measuring just over 9 feet in length, with a skull that required 2 hands to lift. The county surveyor signed his name to the report. 3 other witnesses provided affidavits, and the remains were crated and prepared for shipment to the Smithsonian Institution. 5 years later, on May 4, 1902, the New York Times published an account from Guadalajara, Mexico, where workers constructing a dam unearthed what the paper called a city of giants. The skeletons reportedly averaged 8 feet, some reaching 10. The article noted unusual dental formations, double rows of teeth in several specimens. Local authorities documented the find. Medical professionals examined the remains, and then, like so many others, the story simply ended. Between these 2 reports lie hundreds more. Scientific American in the 1880s documented discoveries in Pennsylvania burial mounds. The San Diego Union in 1895 reported 9-foot skeletons found during railway construction. Nevada newspapers throughout the 1890s and early 1900s chronicled finds in Lovelock Cave, massive skeletal remains with red hair preserved in the dry climate, matching tribal legends of a red-haired giant race that once inhabited the region. Ohio's earthwork mounds produced their own catalogue of anomalies. Excavations in the 1880s and 1890s, conducted by county historical societies and documented in local gazettes, repeatedly described skeletons of unusual proportion. 7 feet was common enough to merit only brief mention. 8 to 9 feet drew more attention. Anything beyond that warranted detailed reports, witness statements, and in some cases, photographs. California's Channel Islands yielded similar findings. Archaeological surveys in the early 1900s uncovered burial sites containing remains that investigators described as remarkably large-framed individuals, with some measuring beyond 7.5 feet. The reports included measurements, sketches, and catalogue numbers for museum shipment. These weren't publications known for sensationalism. The New York Times, Scientific American, and regional newspapers of the period operated under editorial standards that valued credibility. Printing fabrications risked reputation and readership. Yet page after page, decade after decade, they documented the same anomaly, skeletal remains of proportions that don't appear in modern anthropology textbooks. The pattern creates a particular kind of discomfort. If a single newspaper made a mistake, we could dismiss it. If a handful exaggerated for readership, we could understand. But over 1,000 reports across 70 years, spanning multiple states and involving credible witnesses, surveyors, physicians, historical society members, that's not error. That's documentation. And yet, ask any curator at a natural history museum today where you might examine one of these specimens. Ask any anthropology professor which university houses the remains. Ask where the bones went. The answers will be remarkably consistent, nowhere anyone can point to. Not in catalogues, not in storage, not in the public record. Somewhere between excavation and exhibition, between documentation and display, an entire category of archaeological evidence simply evaporated from collective memory. History has a way of forgetting what doesn't fit, and these discoveries didn't fit anything we're taught about the human past. Walk into any natural history museum in the world and you'll find exhibits dedicated to mysteries that captivate us. Dinosaur extinction, the construction of Egyptian pyramids, the migration patterns of early hominids. Entire wings devoted to questions we haven't fully answered. Placards invite speculation. Interactive displays encourage wonder. We celebrate not knowing as long as we're asking the right questions. But some questions have been quietly removed from the catalogue of acceptable curiosity. Know just what's missing. In 100 rooms dedicated to human prehistory, you won't find a single exhibit examining the newspaper reports of giant skeletal remains. No display case presenting the problem, no academic symposium debating the evidence, no documentary series investigating the pattern. The silence is so complete that most people don't realize there's anything to be silent about. This absence becomes stranger when you compare it to topics that remain endlessly debated. Atlantis gets university conferences. Ancient aliens fill cable television programming. Lost civilizations inspire best-selling books and museum special exhibitions. These subjects maintain cultural visibility despite equally ambiguous evidence. They're considered worthy of investigation, even if only to debunk them. But giants? The subject has been surgically excised from public discourse. History provides context for how this happens. Civilizations have always controlled narrative by choosing what to remember and what to forget. Victors write textbooks that omit uncomfortable truths about the conquered. Institutions preserve some artifacts while quietly discarding others. Information doesn't disappear through dramatic suppression, it fades through benign neglect. Don't investigate, don't display, don't discuss, and within 2 generations, the question itself becomes unthinkable. The strategy has a name, plausible deniability through neglect. You don't need to hide evidence when you can simply choose never to look for it. You don't need to suppress discussion when you can make the topic socially awkward to raise. Mention giants at an academic conference and watch colleagues shift uncomfortably, eager to discuss anything else. Of course, skeptics have their explanation ready. The whole thing was a hoax. The 1800s produced plenty of fabricated giant skeletons, sideshow attractions built from plaster and animal bones designed to separate curious crowds from their money. These fakes are documented, proven, and frequently cited as evidence that all giant discoveries were fraudulent. But here's the uncomfortable question that reasoning creates. Does the existence of counterfeit money prove all money is counterfeit? If someone fabricates evidence of a phenomenon, does that automatically invalidate every report of that phenomenon? Or does it provide the perfect mechanism for dismissal point to the fakes, and suddenly every photograph, every newspaper report, every witness account can be waved away without examination? The hoaxes might have done more damage to the truth than any deliberate cover-up could have managed. They gave future generations permission to stop asking questions. And we did stop asking. Somewhere between 1920 and now, giants transitioned from documented curiosity to cultural punchline. The question became unspeakable not because it was answered, but because asking it marked you as unserious. The strangest thing isn't what was found in those burial mounds, it's that we collectively agreed to forget we were ever looking. This isn't a story about proving that giants once walked the earth. It's a story about why the question itself has become impossible to ask in polite company. Human history, as we're taught it, follows a comfortable arc, simple to complex, primitive to sophisticated, chaos to order. Our institutions, universities, museums, governments, religious organizations have built entire frameworks around this narrative. Evolution progresses linearly, civilizations rise predictably, human variation stays within acceptable parameters. The story is clean, contained, and above all, controllable. Giants don't fit that story. They suggest something messier, something that implies human history wasn't a steady march forward, but perhaps a series of cycles, rises and falls, lost branches on a tree we've barely begun to map. They hint at a past more chaotic and strange than the one presented in textbooks, and chaos makes institutions uncomfortable. What if the silence around giants wasn't orchestrated by a single conspiracy, but emerged organically from multiple institutions, each with its own reasons for discomfort? Religious institutions might have struggled with theological implications. Academic institutions might have found the evidence incompatible with evolutionary models. Governmental agencies might have wanted to avoid cultural conflicts with indigenous peoples whose lands contained these burial sites. No coordination necessary, just parallel incentives pointing toward the same conclusion. Better not to look. 3 possibilities will weave through everything that follows. First, that giants were real, physically real, and evidence was actively suppressed or passively ignored by institutions that couldn't accommodate the implications. Second, that the reports documented genuine discoveries of unusual remains, megafauna bones, individuals with gigantism, tall ancient populations, but these were misidentified and exaggerated into something they weren't. Third, that giants never existed physically, but represent something profound about human psychology, our need to imagine powerful ancestors or threatening others encoded in myth across every culture. The answer might be all 3 at once, or none of them completely. Picture an archaeological site in rural Ohio as the sun sets. The year is 1897. According to the Marion Daily Star, a burial mound was opened here, yielding skeletal remains of extraordinary size. Workers documented the find. A local physician examined the bones. Arrangements were made for museum transfer. Now the field sits empty. Corn grows where the mound once stood. No historical marker notes what was found. No museum displays what was sent. The discovery exists only in yellowed newspaper archives that almost no one reads. The silence where evidence should be speaks louder than any bone ever could. It suggests that some questions aren't meant to have answers sine, the appearance of never having been asked. The ancient Greeks didn't build temples to metaphors. When they carved stone reliefs depicting the gigantomachith war between the Olympian gods and the giants, they weren't creating allegory. They were documenting what they believed to be history. In the 2nd century CE, a Greek traveller named Pausanias walked the length and breadth of his homeland, recording everything he encountered. His description of Greece reads like a guidebook, noting temples, statues, and local customs with the matter-of-fact precision of someone documenting observable reality. In the same tone he used to describe architectural dimensions, Pausanias recorded the discovery of giant bones. On the island of Kos, he wrote, enormous skeletal remains had been unearthed following an earthquake. The locals identified them as the bones of giants killed in the primordial war against the gods. Pausanias didn't question this interpretation. He noted it the same way he'd note the colour of marble in a nearby temple. Another Greek writer, Philostratus, documented similar finds, massive bones emerging from the earth in various locations around the Aegean, each attributed to fallen giants or heroes whose size matched their legendary stature. The Greeks possessed no concept that would separate mythology from history in the way we do. Their past was populated by gods who walked as men, heroes who performed impossible feats, and giants who built walls with stones too heavy for ordinary humans to lift. The massive fortification walls at Tiryns and Mycenae were called Cyclopean, built by the Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants of legend, because no other explanation seemed reasonable to people examining the engineering. The Titans, the older generation of gods overthrown by Zeus, were described in terms that emphasized their physical enormity. Orion, the great hunter, was said to stand so tall he could walk through the deepest sea with his head above water. The bronze giant Talos, who guarded Crete, was described in measurements, not metaphors. These weren't symbolic figures representing abstract concepts. They were understood as beings that had actually existed in an earlier age of the world. Modern scholars suggest the Greeks were simply encountering the fossilized remains of extinct megafauna mastodons, mammoths, elephants, and constructing mythological explanations for what they couldn't otherwise understand. It's a neat explanation, perhaps too neat, because the Greeks weren't primitive. They were sophisticated astronomers, mathematicians, physicians, and natural philosophers. They dissected animals to understand anatomy. They studied bones with the same empirical attention they brought to geometry. When Pausanias recorded giant bones, he did so in the same documentary style he used for everything else, as if describing something as ordinary as finding pottery shards. The ancient world didn't find giants controversial. That discomfort came later, when the modern world decided which parts of the past were acceptable to remember and which were safer to forget. The Paiute people of Nevada didn't speak of giants as legend. They spoke of them as enemies their ancestors had fought and killed. The oral history, passed down through generations, describes a race called the Si-Te-Cah carrot-head giants who lived along the shores of what is now Pyramid Lake. According to the Paiute, these beings were hostile, cannibalistic, and considerably larger than ordinary humans. For years, the tribes in the region lived in uneasy proximity to the Si-Te-Cah, avoiding conflict when possible. But as the giants' aggression increased and their raids on Paiute villages became more frequent, the tribes did something remarkable. They unified. Multiple Paiute bands along with neighbouring tribes coordinated an attack. They tracked the Si-Te-Cah to their refugee cave system near what is now Lovelock, Nevada. The giants retreated deep inside. The tribes, rather than following them into the darkness, made a different choice. They piled brush and wood at the cave entrance and set it ablaze. Those who tried to escape were killed with arrows. Those who remained inside suffocated. The oral history is specific about this. It wasn't myth or metaphor. It was war, and it ended with extermination. When Lovelock Cave was excavated beginning in 1911, the discoveries were difficult to dismiss. Miners first, then archaeologists from the University of California found sandals woven from tule reeds measuring 15 to 22 inches in length. They found handprints on the cave walls placed high, as if made by someone considerably taller than average. And according to multiple contemporary accounts, they found skeletal remains measuring over 7 feet, with red hair still preserved in the dry Nevada air. The Paiute account included details that shouldn't have been there if the story were pure invention: the location of the cave, the methods used in the siege, even the physical description of the giants, including their distinctive hair colour. Archaeology confirmed the location. It confirmed the fire damage at the cave entrance. It confirmed the red hair. This wasn't an isolated account. Across North America, indigenous oral histories contain similar testimonies, specific and consistent. The Delaware and Iroquois peoples spoke of the Allegui, a race of giants who once inhabited the Ohio River Valley before being driven out or destroyed in warfare. The Choctaw described a race of giants in their ancestral lands, remembered not as gods or spirits but as a people who had lived, fought, and eventually disappeared. Aztec codices referenced Kinametsan, a race of giants who existed in previous world ages, their bones occasionally discovered when the earth was disturbed. Western academia has historically struggled with oral tradition as historical evidence. Written records are privileged. Spoken testimony is categorized as folklore. But indigenous peoples maintained these histories with extraordinary precision across millennia, passing them through structured oral tradition systems designed specifically to preserve accuracy. Elders corrected younger speakers who deviated from established accounts. Stories were told in formal contexts where accuracy mattered. The pattern creates an uncomfortable question. If these accounts are dismissed as myth, what criteria are being used? Is it the content that makes them unacceptable, or simply the method of transmission? The Paiute, when asked about the Si-Te-Cah, didn't speak as if recounting an entertaining story. They spoke as if describing history. Their great-grandfathers had fought these beings. The bones in the cave proved it. And then those bones, like so many others, disappeared into museum storage and were never seen again. Every Sunday, millions of people read passages about giants in Canaan. Almost no one asks why we've never found their cities. The reference appears early in Genesis 64, just before the story of the flood. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and they bore children to them. The passage is brief, enigmatic, and treated by most modern readers as peripheral to the larger narrative. But the ancient Hebrews who wrote it didn't present it as allegory or poetry. They presented it as fact. The word Nephilim comes from the Hebrew root nephil, meaning to fall. They were the fallen ones, or those who descended. The text describes them as gibber, mighty men, warriors of renown. Size and strength are implied throughout, but later biblical passages make the proportions explicit. Numbers 13 recounts the story of Israelite spies sent to scout Canaan before invasion. They return with a troubling report. "We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." This isn't mythology. It's military intelligence delivered by scouts assessing enemy populations. The spies are describing physical beings occupying specific territory, and they're describing them as giants. The biblical text names distinct giant races inhabiting the ancient Near East: the Anakim in Canaan, the Rephaim in the Transjordan, the Emim in Moab, the Zamzumim in Ammon. These aren't vague mythological creatures. They're presented as tribes, complete with territorial boundaries and genealogies. Then there are the named individuals. Og, king of Bashan, whose iron bed measured 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, approximately 13 to 14 feet in length. The text specifies that this bed was on display in Rabbah, as if inviting readers to verify the claim. Goliath of Gath, the Philistine warrior who stood 6 cubits and a span, roughly 9 feet tall, wearing armor weighing over 100 pounds. David's victory over him isn't framed as a mythological triumph over a symbolic monster. It's presented as historical military combat between two physical beings, one of whom happened to be extraordinarily large. Ancient Hebrew commentaries and rabbinic literature treated these passages literally. The Nephilim existed. Giants inhabited Canaan. This was simply part of the historical record, no more controversial than accounts of other nations Israel encountered. Modern religious interpretation has grown increasingly uncomfortable with literalism here. Many theologians now suggest the passages are metaphorical. The giants represent spiritual corruption or political power or some other abstraction. The language about sons of God and daughters of men is spiritualized to avoid uncomfortable implications about divine beings procreating with humans. But this reinterpretation is recent. For most of religious history, these texts were understood plainly. There had been giants, they had been numerous enough to populate entire regions, and they had been destroyed either through divine judgment or military conquest. The Book of Enoch, excluded from most biblical canons but preserved in Ethiopian Christianity and found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, expands the narrative considerably. It describes 200 angels descending to Mount Hermon, taking human wives and fathering offspring who became giants. These giants grew to enormous size, consumed vast resources, and eventually turned violent, prompting divine intervention through the flood. The text provides names, locations, and detailed genealogies. It reads like a historical chronicle, not fantasy literature. The pattern is striking. Texts that billions of people regard as foundational to Western civilization contain repeated, specific, geographically anchored references to giant races. The discomfort with taking these passages at face value is a modern development, emerging precisely when physical evidence might have been expected to surface. And yet, biblical archaeology has excavated Jericho, Jerusalem, and countless ancient Near Eastern sites. It has never displayed the bones of the Anakim, the armor of Goliath, or the bed of Og. The pattern doesn't stop at the Mediterranean or the Americas. It circles the entire globe, appearing in cultures that had no contact with each other, no shared texts, no possibility of borrowed mythology. In Norse cosmology, giants weren't peripheral monsters. They were foundational. The Jötnar inhabited Jotunheim, one of the 9 realms, and the first being to exist was Ymir, a giant from whose body the gods fashioned the earth itself. His flesh became soil, his blood the oceans, his bones the mountains, his skull the sky. The Norse didn't treat giants as aberrations, but as essential to existence itself. They were ancient, powerful, and in constant tension with the gods. The sagas describe them with the same documentary precision used for human kings and warriors. Move eastward to the Indian subcontinent, and the pattern continues. The Mahabharata and Ramayana epic texts that form the backbone of Hindu tradition describe the Daityas and Rakshasas, giant warrior races of immense strength and supernatural abilities. These weren't symbolic beings representing abstract concepts. They had names, genealogies, kingdoms, and armies. They fought wars with consequences that shaped the landscape. Ravana, the Rakshasa king of Lanka, was described as towering and multi-headed in some traditions, a physical being who ruled a physical kingdom. In sub-Saharan Africa, Zulu oral traditions speak of giant races that inhabited the land before their ancestors arrived. These accounts describe beings of extraordinary height who left behind massive footprints in stone footprints that, interestingly, still exist in certain regions of South Africa, carved into bedrock, their origins still debated. Travel to Patagonia at the southern tip of South America and you find the accounts of Magellan's expedition in 1520. His crew documented encounters with the Tehuelche people, whom they described as giants, and reports claiming heights of 7 to 8 feet. Later measurements suggest the Tehuelche averaged around 6 feet, notably tall for indigenous Americans but not impossibly so. Yet the giant designation stuck, preserved in the region's name, Patagonia, the land of the big feet. Japan's folklore contains the Oni and Kyojingian beings, often depicted as violent and monstrous, but treated in historical texts as if they once physically existed. Chinese legends speak of giant emperors and warriors from ancient dynasties, their unusual size seen as a mark of divine favour or ancestral power. Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime stories describe giant beings who shaped mountains and carved valleys during the creation period, their massive forms leaving permanent marks on the landscape. The details converge in unsettling ways. Across continents, giants are described as violent or threatening. They're associated with ancient times, with a world before the current human order. They're often said to have been destroyed, driven away, or disappeared through warfare or divine intervention, and in multiple traditions, from Greece to the Americas to the Pacific. They're described with specific physical anomalies, elongated skulls, unusual dentition, sometimes 6 fingers or toes. If giants were merely psychological projections, why would isolated cultures project the same specific details? If they were just stories about scary others, why the consistency in physical description? Either humanity everywhere independently invented the same imaginary being, or humanity everywhere independently remembered encountering something real. The weight of global testimony becomes difficult to ignore. These aren't vague folktales. They're specific accounts preserved across millennia, describing something that every culture felt was important enough to remember. Newspapers in the late 1800s operated under different standards than modern media. They were community records, documenting births, deaths, property sales and local events with the understanding that credibility mattered. Printing fabrications risked losing readership in small towns where everyone knew everyone. When the New York Times reported archaeological discoveries, it did so with the same sobriety it applied to economic news or political developments. On December 7, 1895, the Times published an article titled Prehistoric Anthropoid Found in Ohio. It described the excavation of a burial mound in Chillicothe that yielded skeletal remains measuring 9 feet in length. The report included measurements. The jawbone fit over the face of a normal-sized man with room to spare, the eye sockets were unusually large, and the femur exceeded 2 feet in length. The article noted that Professor Thomas Wilson from the Smithsonian Institution had been contacted regarding the find. This wasn't an isolated report. That same decade, the San Diego Union documented discoveries made during Southern Pacific Railroad construction near San Diego. Workers unearthed skeletal remains from what appeared to be an ancient burial ground. Multiple witnesses, including the construction foreman and a local physician, examined the bones and estimated heights between 8 and 10 feet. The remains were described as proportionally normal, simply scaled larger. Wisconsin newspapers between 1897 and 1912 published numerous accounts of giant skeleton discoveries during systematic excavations of Native American burial mounds. The Decatur Republican in 1897 described county surveyors opening a mound near Maple Creek and finding remains exceeding 9 feet with a skull of enormous dimensions. The bones were measured, documented, crated, and according to the report, shipped to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis and preservation. Similar reports appeared in the Dodgeville Chronicle, the Madison Democrat, and the Lake Mills Spectator, different papers, different years, different locations, yet remarkably consistent details. Discoveries were made during official surveys or construction projects, not treasure hunting expeditions. Witnesses included county officials, historical society members, and local physicians people whose professional reputations depended on accuracy. The pattern in these reports is striking. Skeletal remains of unusual size, often with unusual features. Some accounts mentioned double rows of teeth. Others describe elongated skulls or additional vertebrae. Several reported six-fingered hands. The discoveries were treated as noteworthy but not fantastical, interesting archaeological finds deserving documentation and further study. Nearly all reports mentioned the same destination, the Smithsonian Institution, or occasionally other museums and universities. The bones were being preserved for science. They were entering official collections where future researchers could examine them. In 1912, the New York Times published another account, this time from Wisconsin, describing the excavation of a burial mound that yielded 18 giant skeletons arranged in a group burial. The article specified that the remains were being sent to the Smithsonian for cataloguing and study. Search the Smithsonian's public catalogue today for any of these specimens. Search their storage facilities, their archives, their published research from that era. The result is uniform nothing. No catalogue entries, no research papers analysing the remains, no specimens in storage. When questioned directly, the Smithsonian's official position has remained consistent. They have no records of receiving giant human skeletal remains, and none exist in their collections. But the newspaper said they were sent. Multiple newspapers across multiple decades, documenting multiple shipments to the same institution. Either the papers manufactured elaborate lies for no apparent benefit, or something happened to the bones between excavation and exhibition. The disappearance itself demands explanation. Okay, the internet is filled with photographs of giant skeletons. Most of them are fake. This needs to be stated clearly. Digital manipulation has made creating convincing giant skeleton images trivially easy. Photoshop contests in the early 2000s produced dozens of composite images showing archaeological excavations with impossibly large skeletal remains. These images spread across social media, presented as genuine discoveries, and were systematically debunked. Normal-sized skeletons photographed from angles that distorted scale. Animal bones arranged to resemble human proportions. Complete fabrications with visible editing artifacts. The existence of these fakes has done something interesting. It's provided blanket justification for dismissing all photographic evidence regardless of provenance or era. But not every photograph claiming to show unusual skeletal remains comes from the digital age. Some date to periods when photographic manipulation required expertise, resources, and equipment available only to professionals. Glass plate negatives from the 1890s couldn't be edited with software. Creating a convincing fake required physical construction of props, careful staging, and technical skill that left traces. Photographs exist in archives from Smithsonian-sponsored expeditions in the late 1800s, showing excavation sites with skeletal structures that appear oversized relative to the workers present. Images from the Lovelock Cave excavations in Nevada show skulls and long bones with unusual proportions documented during university-led archaeological surveys. Photographs from Çatalhöyük in Turkey and other Mediterranean sites occasionally show skeletal remains where proportions seem inconsistent with average human dimensions. The challenge becomes forensic. How do you authenticate a photograph that's over a century old? Experts examine shadow angles for consistency, verify whether the image appeared in period publications, investigate the photographer's credentials and documented work, analyze visible bone morphology for anatomical accuracy. Some photographs pass these tests. Some fail, and some remain genuinely ambiguous, neither provably authentic nor demonstrably fabricated. This creates a logical trap. Because many giant skeleton photographs are proven hoaxes, the default assumption becomes that all such photographs must be hoaxes. Dismissal through association. The fakes contaminate the entire category, making it intellectually safer to reject everything than to examine individual cases on their merits. Yet this reasoning has a problem. If counterfeit currency exists, we don't conclude all currency is counterfeit. We develop methods to distinguish real from fake. But with giant skeleton photographs, the existence of fakes has been used to justify never developing those methods or, worse, never applying them. Some photographs in archaeological archives show clear documentation, catalogue numbers, location data, names of supervising archaeologists, publication in period journals. These aren't anonymous images circulating on conspiracy websites. They're part of institutional records, filed alongside other excavation documentation. And yet, they're treated as if they don't exist. Not examined, not displayed, not discussed in academic contexts. The visual evidence sits in archives, neither definitively authenticated nor formally debunked, occupying a strange space of willful neglect. Fake photographs prove someone wanted you to believe in giants. But the institutional refusal to rigorously examine potentially authentic photographs raises a different question. Who benefits from ensuring you never believe the real ones? Discoveries documented in newspapers might be dismissed as amateur finds by untrained observers. But what happens when the excavations are conducted by credentialed archaeologists from respected institutions following professional protocols? Lovelock Cave in Nevada provides a case study. Between 1911 and 1924, the site was excavated by researchers from the University of California, Berkeley, including Alfred Kroeber, one of the founding figures of American anthropology. This wasn't a treasure hunt, it was systematic archaeological investigation with documentation, cataloguing, and academic oversight. The excavations yielded artifacts that matched Paiute oral traditions with unsettling precision. Woven sandals made from tule reeds measuring between 15 and 22 inches in length were recovered and photographed. Unless these were ceremonial objects designed for non-functional purposes, a claim made but never convincingly demonstrated, they suggest feet far larger than average. Skulls described in some contemporary accounts as notably oversized were found, though official measurements place them at the upper range of normal human variation. Distinctive artifacts indicated a culture that had occupied the cave for an extended period. The controversy emerges in interpretation. Sensationalist accounts, including some newspaper reports from the period, claim skeletons measuring 8 to 10 feet were discovered. Official archaeological reports describe remains as large-framed individuals, but within the spectrum of human variation, perhaps reaching 7 feet at most. Both accounts reference the same excavation. Who's correct depends partly on which sources you trust and partly on how you interpret ambiguous measurements from partially preserved remains. Move to Cahokia Mounds in Illinois, one of the most significant pre-Columbian sites in North America. Bureau of American Ethnology excavations in the 1920s produced field notes still accessible in archives that occasionally reference specimens of unusual proportion or large-framed individuals in burial contexts. Yet the published monographs from these same excavations normalize these descriptions or omit them entirely. A skeleton described as exceptionally large in field notes becomes tall adult male. In publication, a subtle shift that erases specificity. In England, the Beckton Castle excavation of 1932 reportedly uncovered oversized skulls during construction work. Local newspapers documented the find. Photographs were allegedly taken. The specimens were said to have been transferred to a museum. Today, no trace remains, no catalogue entry, no photographs in archives, no mention in subsequent archaeological literature. A pattern emerges across professional excavations, field observations, recorded in the moment by researchers on site, sometimes note unusual size. Official publications, written later and subjected to peer review and editorial oversight, either minimize these observations or omit them entirely. Several explanations exist. Bones degraded by time can be difficult to measure accurately. Initial estimates made in the field might be revised after careful laboratory analysis. Professional skepticism might lead researchers to report conservatively, presenting only claims they can defend absolutely. These are reasonable possibilities, but there's another possibility. Early 20th century academic culture operated under intense pressure toward conformity. Prevailing theories about human evolution and migration had been established. Extraordinary claims threatened careers. Journal editors and senior researchers controlled what got published. A young archaeologist finding something anomalous faced a choice: report it and risk professional marginalization, or normalize it and preserve your career. The structural incentives didn't require conspiracy. They simply made controversial findings difficult to publish, even if genuine. Field notebooks could record what was seen. Then, official reports recorded what was acceptable to say. And the difference between those two things might explain why so much evidence exists in preliminary form but vanishes from final publications. The digital age promised to settle the question. High-resolution cameras, DNA analysis, instant global communication, surely modern technology would either confirm or conclusively debunk giant skeleton discoveries. Instead, it complicated everything. In 2004, images began circulating online showing archaeological excavations in India with skeletal remains measuring 15 to 18 feet. The photographs looked convincing. Proper excavation grids, official-looking archaeologists, realistic bone proportions. Within weeks they were exposed as digital fabrications, entries from a photo manipulation contest that had been stripped of context and presented as genuine discoveries. The hoax spread faster than the debunking. Ecuador produced more ambiguous claims. Researchers working in remote regions reported finding unusually large skeletal remains and enormous stone tools. Some photographs showed what appeared to be oversized bones. Other researchers disputed the findings, claiming the remains were misidentified animal bones or normal human remains photographed with forced perspective. The debate continues, evidence remaining contested and inaccessible for independent verification. Bulgaria offered something different, genuine archaeological discoveries of tall individuals, documented through proper channels, published in peer-reviewed contexts. Excavations in the Varna necropolis and other sites revealed skeletal remains of individuals measuring 7 to 7.5 feet, tall exceptional but not impossible, representing the extreme upper range of human height variation rather than something beyond human biology. Modern archaeology has, in fact, discovered ancient humans who were giants by any reasonable measure. Homo heidelbergensis remains from various European sites suggest individuals exceeding 7 feet. Genetic analysis of ancient populations reveals greater height variation than modern humans exhibit. Discoveries in the Caucasus region and parts of Africa document populations where 7-foot individuals weren't rare anomalies, but represented one end of normal distribution. The medical explanation adds another layer. Gigantism caused by pituitary disorders can produce individuals reaching 8 or even 9 feet in modern populations. Ancient populations would have included similar cases. A society encountering even a few individuals with medical gigantism might remember them as evidence of a giant race, especially if those individuals held positions of power or prominence that ensured their memory endured. So the question shifts, does the absence of 15-foot skeletons prove all giant accounts were fabrications? Or does evidence of genuinely tall ancient populations, individuals, and perhaps entire groups averaging 7 to 8 feet suggest the legends contain truth, amplified through cultural memory until the impressive became the impossible? Modern archaeology's advantage is transparency. Digital documentation, peer review, open access databases make evidence harder to suppress or lose. Exceptional finds receive scrutiny from global research communities, not just local institutions. Yet even now, certain discoveries remain underreported. Findings that challenge conventional narratives face skeptical peer review. Researchers still hesitate before making claims that might damage credibility. The mechanisms have changed, but institutional conservatism persists. Modern archaeology has found giants. It just refuses to call them that, because naming them acknowledges the possibility that all those newspaper reports, all those indigenous accounts, all those ancient texts might have been describing something real, just not as extraordinary as memory made it. 1,000 discoveries, 0 remains. The mathematics of this absence defies comfortable explanation. Hundreds of newspaper reports across 7 decades documenting skeletal remains sent to museums for preservation and study. Multiple witnesses per Discovery County officials, physicians, historical society members, people whose professional credibility depended on accuracy. Institutional handling, catalogue numbers assigned, shipping, manifests documenting transfer to the Smithsonian and other major museums. And yet, nothing remains accessible for modern analysis. Bones are durable. Skeletal remains survive millennia in the ground, protected only by soil and favourable chemistry. Once in museum storage, protected from elements and biological decay, they should survive indefinitely. If even 10% of the documented discoveries were genuine, museum collections should contain dozens of specimens, mandibles, femurs, skulls, teeth. The most durable evidence of human existence, preserved in the most controlled environments humans can create. 3 possibilities exist. First, every report was fabrication or misidentification, hundreds of independent witnesses across decades deceived or incompetent. Second, the bones existed but were lost through institutional negligence, degraded in storage or discarded during catalogue purges without record. Third, the bones existed and were deliberately removed from public accessibility. None of these explanations is comfortable. Each requires believing something unsettling, that our ancestors were systematically unreliable, that our institutions are incompetent at their core function, or that evidence has been actively suppressed. Sometimes absence speaks louder than presence. The fact that this question makes people uncomfortable, that merely asking it feels transgressive, reveals something important. Either our understanding of the past is more fragile than we admit, or our need to believe certain things about human history is stronger than our commitment to evidence. The bones are gone. The silence remains. Stand before the walls of Sacsayhuaman, overlooking Cuzco in the Peruvian highlands, and the first thing you feel isn't wonder. It's vertigo. The sensation that something is wrong with the scene in front of you, that the proportions violate some fundamental law you can't quite name. Individual limestone blocks, some weighing over 100 tons, fit together with such precision that a knife blade cannot slide between them. No mortar binds them. The shapes are irregular complex polygons with multiple angles, each stone cut to match its neighbours perfectly despite having no two surfaces alike. Modern engineers examine these walls and struggle to explain how they were constructed even with contemporary technology. The precision required, the weight involved, the sheer logistics of moving, lifting and placing stones this massive with tools we believe the Inca possessed. None of it adds up to a comfortable answer. When Spanish conquistadors arrived and asked the Inca who built these structures, the answer they received was unexpected. We didn't. The giants before the flood built these walls. The Spanish laughed. Modern engineers have stopped laughing. Travel west to Baalbek in Lebanon and the scale becomes even more impossible. The stone of the pregnant woman lies partially cut from bedrock, weighing over 1,000 tons. Nearby, incorporated into the foundation of the Roman temple complex, sit 3 stones called the trilithon. Each weighs approximately 800 tons. They were quarried, transported, lifted and placed with such precision that their seams are nearly invisible. Modern cranes can barely approach these weights under ideal conditions with steel cables and hydraulic systems. Ancient builders allegedly accomplished it with Bronze Age technology, wooden rollers and human labour. The mathematics become uncomfortable. How many workers would be needed? What kind of rope could bear such weight without snapping? How would the stones be lifted vertically and positioned with millimetre accuracy? The orthodox explanations exist: earthen ramps, massive labour forces, patience measured in decades, techniques we've simply forgotten. These explanations work for some structures, but at Baalbek, the infrastructure required for such methods would itself have been monumental ramps larger than the temple, support systems that left no archaeological trace, organisational capabilities that rival modern construction projects. Move further east to Göbekli Tepe in Turkey and time itself becomes the problem. Massive T-shaped pillars, some weighing 20 tons, carved with intricate reliefs and erected in circular arrangements. The site dates to approximately 11,000 years agamillennia, before agriculture, before pottery, before any civilization we recognize. According to established chronology, the people who built Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers, supposedly lacking the social organization, tool technology, or architectural knowledge for such construction. Yet the stones stand. Every culture that built or inherited these structures shared a common explanation. The Greeks said the massive walls at Mycenae and Tiryns were cyclopean, built by giants, because only giants could move such stones. Peruvian traditions attributed pre-Inca megalithic construction to giants who lived before the Great Flood. These weren't poetic metaphors. They were the most logical explanations people could offer when confronted with engineering that exceeded anything they could accomplish themselves. Modern archaeology treats these attributions as primitive misunderstanding. Ancient peoples encountered structures they couldn't explain, so they invented supernatural builders. But this interpretation assumes ancient peoples were less observant, less rational than we are. Perhaps they were simply describing what they believed to be true. The Greeks had a name for walls, built from massive, irregular stones fitted without mortar, cyclopean masonry. They named it after the Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants of mythology, because they couldn't imagine human beings moving such stones. It wasn't poetry, it was the most rational explanation available. The Lion Gate at Mycenae, the fortification walls at Tiryns, the megalithic temples on Malta, and the Nurahi of Sardiniol share this construction technique. Massive blocks, often weighing several tons each, precisely fitted despite irregular shapes, creating structures that have stood for millennia. When Pausanias toured these ruins in the 2nd century, he recorded the local belief that only giants could have built them. He didn't argue. The evidence seemed obvious. Then something strange happened. As exploration expanded globally, similar structures appeared in places that should have had no connection to the Mediterranean world. Sacsayhuaman in Peru, Pumapunku in Bolivia. The platforms of Easter Island, certain sections of Egyptian temples, Baalbek in Lebanon, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, Osirisen in Japan, all employing variations of the same technique, massive stones, irregular shapes, precise fitting, no mortar. The architectural signature repeats across continents, separated by oceans and millennia. Orthodox chronology places these structures at different periods, built by cultures with no contact. The conventional explanation is convergent. Development different societies independently discovering that large fitted stones create stable, enduring structures. It's possible people facing similar engineering challenges might reach similar solutions. But the similarities go beyond basic principle. The precision of the fitting, the choice of irregular over regular shapes, the specific methods of interlocking these details repeat with remarkable consistency. Either ancient engineering had fewer viable solutions than we assume, or something connected these building traditions that we haven't accounted for. Some researchers propose the Atlantis hypothesis. A sophisticated pre-Ice Age civilization possessed advanced stoneworking knowledge, then influenced or taught later cultures before vanishing. The theory remains controversial, unsupported by definitive evidence, yet the pattern of megalithic construction distribution continues to resist comfortable explanation. The giant question returns in a different form. If we dismiss giants as literal builders, we must explain how unrelated cultures separated by thousands of miles achieved nearly identical impossible construction feats. If we consider giants, we must redefine what giant means. Perhaps not 20-foot beings, but a lost civilization whose capabilities seemed gigantic compared to those who came after. A people whose engineering knowledge was so advanced that later cultures, lacking that knowledge, could only explain the structures by invoking builders of superhuman size and strength. The Greeks said Cyclopes built Mycenae's walls. For 3,000 years we called it myth. Then we found identical walls on Easter Island, constructed by a people who had never heard of Cyclopes, who told their own stories of giants moving stones that ordinary humans couldn't. Either humanity independently invented the same myth everywhere, or the myth preserves something real that we've chosen to forget. In the Cairo Museum, there's a stone hammer too heavy for one man to lift. The label says ceremonial. Nobody asks for what ceremony you need a 200-pound hammer. Oversized stone tools appear in archaeological records from India, Africa, and Europe. Massive axes, hammers, and implements described in expedition reports, but quickly categorized as ceremonial rather than functional. The designation is convenient. Ceremonial objects don't require explanation. They're symbolic, not practical, so their impractical dimensions become irrelevant. But many of these objects show wear patterns consistent with use. The stone is abraded where it would contact other materials during work. The handles, when they survive, show grit marks. They're designed with the ergonomics of tools meant to be wielded, not displayed. The Damascus Museum, before recent conflicts, displayed a sword of extraordinary dimensions, blade length exceeding what a normal-sized human could effectively swing. Photographs exist, though provenance remains disputed. Similar oversized weapons appear in various collections, stone hammers requiring 2 hands to lift, axes with grip dimensions suggesting unusually large hands, spear points scaled beyond practical use for average-sized warriors. Ancient armor provides more concrete evidence. European archaeological sites have yielded Bronze Age armor, pieces breastplates, greaves, helmet-sized for individuals considerably larger than population averages from the period. Finger rings from various contexts occasionally surface with internal diameters too large for normal hands. These aren't modern fabrications, they're catalogued finds from controlled excavations. The Lovelock Cave sandals remain perhaps the most problematic artifacts. Measuring 15 to 22 inches in length, woven from tulle reeds with the same construction technique as smaller, normal-sized sandals found at the site. The conventional explanation suggests ceremonial use or snowshoe-style overwear, but the wear patterns and construction details argue against both theories. They appear to be functional footwear, simply scaled larger. Orthodox archaeology faces a dilemma with such artifacts. Acknowledging them as functional items sized for unusually large individuals opens uncomfortable questions. Dismissing them as ceremonial preserves conventional narratives, but requires ignoring evidence of actual use. Some museums handle these anomalies through quiet omission. The items exist in storage, catalogued but not displayed. mentioned in technical reports but absent from public exhibits. No interpretive placards explain the discrepancy between size and supposed function. The artifacts sit in drawers, neither celebrated nor explained, occupying the same ambiguous space as the giant skeletons that supposedly never existed. If these tools were ceremonial, why the functional design and useware? If they were functional, who was large and strong enough to use them? In 1883, a mound in West Virginia was opened. The burial chamber was 12 feet long. The skeleton inside filled it. Burial architecture reveals something about those it was built to contain. Ancient Egypt's stone sarcophagi vary considerably in size, some elongated well beyond dimensions required for average height individuals. Were these built for particularly tall pharaohs and nobles, or does the size represent spiritual significance, the deceased's importance rather than their physical stature? The question becomes difficult to answer when the remains themselves are missing or poorly documented. European megalithic tombs present similar mysteries. Passage graves in Ireland, dolmens in France, burial chambers across Britain some contain interior spaces that seem disproportionately large for the populations that built them. Excavation reports from the 19th century occasionally note that skeletal remains found within suggested individuals of considerable stature, though precise measurements were rarely recorded. North America's mound builder cultures left thousands of burial mounds across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys. 19th century excavations conducted with more enthusiasm than methodology repeatedly reported discoveries of oversized skeletal remains, sometimes buried alongside normal-sized individuals. The pattern suggested either social stratification, with larger individuals occupying positions of leadership or warrior status, or the coexistence of populations with significantly different average heights. The Grave Creek Mound in West Virginia, excavated in 1838, reportedly contained a burial chamber of unusual dimensions with skeletal remains described as exceptionally large. The Serpent Mound complex in Ohio, the Adena culture sites, the Hopewell burial grounds excavation accounts from these locations frequently mention size anomalies, though, by modern standards, the documentation was inadequate. The interpretation challenge is genuine. Ancient peoples often built monuments larger than strictly necessary, incorporating symbolic dimensions into funerary architecture. A tomb size might reflect the occupant's social status, spiritual importance, or mythological associations rather than physical dimensions. Distinguishing symbolic from practical size requires careful analysis. Forensic approaches exist. Measure interior space against artifacts found within, examine skeletal remains if they survive, look for population patterns across multiple burials. Were certain individuals in a cemetery consistently larger than others? Did burial chambers correlate with skeletal dimensions? Unfortunately, most mound excavations occurred before modern archaeological methods developed. Critical data was lost through hasty excavation, poor documentation, and the treatment of burial sites as curiosities rather than scientific resources. Bones were measured imprecisely or not at all. Contexts weren't recorded. Artifacts were removed without systematic cataloguing. What remains are fragmentary accounts describing burial chambers that seem too large, skeletons that reportedly filled them, and no way to verify the claims because the evidence was destroyed in the process of discovery. Modern engineers can calculate exactly how many workers, rollers, and ramps you'd need to move 100 in stone. The math says it requires technology we didn't have unless someone stronger did the lifting. Engineering analyses of megalithic sites produce uncomfortable numbers. The stones at Baalbek, weighing 800 tons, would require forces that exceed the tensile strength of any rope available in antiquity. The friction coefficients of wooden rollers on earthen ramps, combined with the weight of the Saxe-Huaman blocks, suggest the rollers would shatter before the stones moved. The labour calculations show many workers could physically fit around a stone to apply force simultaneously fall short of what physics demands. Researchers like Christopher Dunn have published studies demonstrating that certain megalithic construction exceeds even modern heavy lifting capacity without specialized equipment. The counter-arguments are reasonable. Ancient engineers possessed knowledge we've lost. They had time and labor resources modern projects can't match. Our reconstructions of their methods may be incomplete, but the counter-arguments often reduce to, we don't know how, but they must have done it somehow, which is, when examined honestly, no less speculative than suggesting the builders possessed capabilities we haven't accounted for. Attributing these structures to giants, whether literal beings of unusual size or a civilization with advanced knowledge, becomes merely one explanation among several inadequate ones. The mathematics rebels against all of them. Perhaps the real question isn't whether giants built these walls. Perhaps it's whether our definition of impossible is calibrated correctly, or whether we're measuring ancient capabilities against modern limitations that didn't apply. The stones stand. The equations don't balance. Something is missing from our understanding. Genesis doesn't describe Nephilim as metaphor. It lists their genealogies, names their descendant clans, and maps where they lived. It treats them as history, not allegory. Passage appears in Genesis 6 verses 1 through 4, just before the flood narrative. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. The text is matter-of-fact, presented with the same historical tone used for genealogies and tribal movements throughout Genesis. The Hebrew reveals layers modern translations obscure. Nephilim derives from Naphil, meaning to fall, the fallen ones, or those who descended. The sons of God, my Elohim in Hebrews, a phrase used elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible to denote divine or semi-divine beings. The offspring are called Jibber, mighty men or warriors, specifically described as men of renown, famous, remembered, significant. Ancient Hebrew readers would have understood this as describing literal events, divine beings or their representatives, procreating with human women, producing offspring of unusual nature and capability. The passage doesn't suggest metaphor or allegory. It states what happened. The Book of Enoch, excluded from most biblical canons but preserved in Ethiopian Christianity and found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, expands the account dramatically. 200 watchers angels assigned to observe humanity descended to Mount Hermon, swore an oath, took human wives, and fathered the Nephilim. These offspring grew to enormous size, described as 300 cubits, tell approximately 450 feet, clearly hyperbolic but emphasizing extraordinary proportions. The giants consumed all human and animal resources, then turned to cannibalism, their violence prompting God to send the flood as judgment and cleansing. Numbers 13 provides post-flood evidence. Israelite spies scouting Canaan before invasion report encountering Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. This isn't poetic language. It's military intelligence describing enemy populations encountered in specific geographic territory. The spies are physically comparing themselves to beings they observed and deemed dangerous enough to recommend against invasion. The biblical text names distinct giant tribes inhabiting the ancient Near East after the flood: Anakim in southern Canaan, Rephaim east of the Jordan River, Emim in Moab, Zamzumim in Ammon. These aren't mythological monsters, but tribes with territorial boundaries mentioned alongside other nations Israel encountered. Deuteronomy describes them as a people strong and numerous and as tall as the Anakites, treating them as historical populations that once existed but were destroyed. For most of religious history, these passages were read literally. The Nephilim existed. Giants inhabited Canaan. Israel fought them. This was simply historical record, uncontroversial. Modern religious interpretation has grown uncomfortable with literalism. Many contemporary theologians spiritualize the passages. Giants represent spiritual corruption, political power, moral degeneracy. The sons of God become Seth's lineage, intermarrying with Cain's descendants, not divine beings. But this reinterpretation is recent, emerging precisely when physical evidence might have been expected to surface if the accounts were literal. Ancient Hebrew authors, writing in documentary style, recording genealogies and migrations and wars, inserted these references to giants with the same historical precision they applied to everything else. Were they recording encounters with genuinely tall populations, preserving cultural memory of something stranger, or documenting something we've decided cannot have existed? Long before Hebrew scribes penned the book of Genesis, another civilization was already recording stories of giants. The Sumerians, history's first known literate society, kept meticulous records carved into clay tablets that still survive today. Among these ancient documents are king lists that describe rulers from before the great flood antediluvian kings who reigned for thousands of years and, according to fragmentary references, possessed bodies that matched their impossibly long lives. These weren't gods in the traditional sense. They were described as hybrids, beings born from unions between divine entities and human women, standing far taller than ordinary men. The most famous example appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving stories. Gilgamesh himself is explicitly described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a mathematical impossibility that suggests something more complex than simple parentage. The text repeatedly emphasizes his extraordinary height and strength, noting that he towered over his subjects and possessed power no normal man could match. His companion Enkidu, fashioned by the gods as his equal, shared these same characteristics: massive stature, strength beyond human limits, a body that seemed to exist in the space between mortal and divine. Were these descriptions literal? Or were the Sumerians speaking in metaphor, using physical size to represent political power and cultural greatness? The texts themselves offer no clear answer, but they do something else entirely. They mirror the Genesis narrative with unsettling precision. The Akkadian texts speak of the Anunnaki, beings who descended from the heavens, walked among humans, and produced offspring through interbreeding. These hybrid children inherited traits from both lineages, creating a race that belonged fully to neither world. The parallels are impossible to ignore: divine beings descending, intimate contact with humanity, offspring of mixed nature, all happening in the world before the flood. The structure of these stories follows the same pattern across cultures separated by language and centuries. Scholars have proposed explanations. Perhaps Hebrew scribes exiled in Babylon borrowed these older Mesopotamian traditions and adapted them. Perhaps both cultures drew from something even more ancient, a shared memory passed down through countless generations. Or perhaps, and this is where the ground beneath our assumptions begins to shift, both civilizations were independently describing the same phenomenon, recording encounters with groups they perceived as fundamentally different, disturbingly powerful, and inexplicably real. The Sumerians didn't distinguish between history and myth the way we do. When they carved stone records of giant kings, they were recording what they considered fact. Cuneiform tablets excavated from Nippur and Ur contain fragmentary references to beings of extraordinary size, catalogued alongside trade agreements and tax records. Their art depicts figures of impossible scale sometimes, clearly symbolic representations of gods and kings, sometimes disturbingly ambiguous. Here's what troubles modern scholars. Mesopotamian civilization built its empire on record-keeping. Their libraries preserved everything: administrative documents, religious texts, historical chronicles. If giants were purely mythological entertainment, why record them with the same documentary precision reserved for warehouse inventories and military campaigns? But what about cultures with no religious investment in these narratives? The Greeks and Romans kept their own records. The ancient Greeks and Romans kept records that were meant to be taken seriously. Their historians travelled extensively, documenting what they saw with the same meticulous attention they gave to architecture, geography, and political events. These were not religious texts or creation myths. They were secular observations written by men who considered themselves chroniclers of the real world, and scattered throughout their writings are accounts of giant bones. Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century CE, produced a comprehensive guide to Greece based on his own extensive travels. His description of Greece catalogues temples, statues, local customs, and historical sites with documentary precision. Among these observations, he describes multiple discoveries of bones belonging to figures of extraordinary size. At Sparta, he documented massive remains identified by locals as belonging to the hero Orestes, who legend claimed stood far taller than ordinary men. At Messene, he recorded bones attributed to the giant Idas. Site after site across the Greek landscape, Pausanias encountered and catalogued discoveries of skeletal remains that exceeded normal human proportions. He wrote about these findings with the same neutral, observational tone he used when describing temples. To him, they were equally factual. Pliny the Elder, Rome's great natural philosopher, documented similar findings in his encyclopedic Natural History. Following an earthquake in Crete, workers uncovered bones of tremendous size, which locals identified as remains of the giant Entellus. Pliny recorded this not as folklore but as natural observation, the same way he documented volcanic activity or unusual animal specimens. Philostratus, in his work Heroica, described giant bones discovered at various locations around the Aegean, treating these findings as historical evidence of an earlier age when beings of greater stature walked the earth. Ancient historians interpreted these discoveries through their cultural framework. They believed in ages of heroes and giants that preceded their own diminished era, so when they encountered oversized bones, attribution to legendary figures seemed logical and consistent with their understanding of history. Modern scholars offer a simpler explanation. These ancient peoples were finding remains of mammoths, mastodons and other extinct megafauna, misidentifying them as human giants due to incomplete anatomical knowledge. It's a reasonable explanation, and in many cases almost certainly correct. Yet not all ancient accounts describe monstrous or animal-like features. Many specifically note bones that appeared recognizably human in proportions, imply scaled larger. Pausanias documented dozens of giant bone discoveries across Greece. He wrote with the same precision he used to describe temples and statues. He believed it all equally real. These classical historians had no religious investment in proving giants existed. They were simply recording observations within their interpretive framework. But could humans actually reach such sizes? What does biology tell us about the physical limits of the human body? Before dismissing ancient accounts as fantasy, we need to ask a more fundamental question. Could humans actually grow that large? Modern medicine provides clear evidence that extraordinary human height is possible. Individuals with pituitary disorders produce excess growth hormone, resulting in documented cases of gigantism. Robert Wadlow reached 8 feet 11 inches before his death in 1940. Fulton Cosin stands at 8 feet 3 inches today. These aren't legends or exaggerations. They're measured, photographed, medically documented realities. Humans can grow far beyond normal ranges. The question isn't whether it happens, but whether it could happen sustainably across populations. Physics presents the first obstacle. The square cube law states that as an organism increases in size, its volume and weight increase faster than its surface area. A 12-foot human would need bones dramatically thicker than ours, muscle attachment points reinforced beyond normal human structure, and a cardiovascular system powerful enough to pump blood to heights our hearts weren't designed to reach. The engineering challenges are substantial. But engineering challenges aren't impossibilities. They're design problems that evolution solves through adaptation. Nature demonstrates this principle repeatedly. Island gigantism produces oversized species in isolated environments. Birdman's rule shows populations in colder climates tending toward larger body size. These aren't anomalies, but predictable evolutionary responses to environmental pressure. The fossil record contains our own evidence. Homo heidelbergensis and other extinct hominids average 6 to 7 feet, with individuals likely exceeding this substantially. Human ancestors were bigger than we are now. Height is controlled by hundreds of genes working in concert. It's highly heritable and varies dramatically across populations. Modern humans show remarkable height variation, even within our genetically bottlenecked species. Before agricultural population explosions and genetic mixing, ancient human groups existed in greater isolation, maintaining genetic variants that no longer survive in modern populations. Could some of these groups have carried combinations of height-related genes producing individuals consistently over 7 or 8 feet? Could outliers have reached 10 feet? The counter-argument is medical. Extremely tall individuals suffer joint deterioration, cardiovascular strain, and shortened lifespans. A sustainable population of giants faces serious health challenges. But survival pressures differ across environments and eras. Traits that reduce lifespan in modern contexts might have been advantageous in ancient ones, where physical dominance determined survival and reproduction. Human biology says giants are impossible. Human fossils say we used to be bigger than we are now. One of these facts makes the other more interesting. 20-foot giants remain biological fantasy, but populations averaging 7 to 9 feet with individuals reaching 10 aren't scientifically unreasonable, especially among extinct hominid species or genetically isolated ancient groups. Which raises another question. What does modern genetic research actually tell us about ancient human diversity? And why do some researchers claim evidence is being systematically suppressed? Here's where the investigation becomes uncomfortable. The same evidence can support completely different conclusions depending on where you begin. Present identical artifacts, texts, and testimonies to 3 researchers, and you'll receive 3 incompatible explanations. The literalist reads ancient texts as straightforward documentation. Giants existed, archaeological anomalies are genuine discoveries, and institutional suppression is protecting uncomfortable truths. The rationalist sees cultural memory encoded in mythology. Ancient peoples encountered unusually tall populations or powerful enemies, transforming real experiences into legendary narratives. Archaeological anomalies become misidentifications, and institutional disinterest reflects legitimate skepticism, not conspiracy. The mythologist interprets giants as psychological archetypes, universal expressions of humanity's fear of the powerful other, collective anxiety about threats from outside the community. All three interpretations have supporting evidence. All three have adherents among serious researchers. The problem isn't lack of evidence. It's that evidence doesn't interpret itself. This creates a predictable dynamic. Believers discount anything contradicting giant narratives. Skeptics dismiss anything supporting them. Both sides accuse the other of closed-mindedness while demonstrating their own. The argument becomes tribal, positions harden, and productive investigation stalls. This interpretive problem extends far beyond giants. It affects how we approach most historical mysteries. Our conclusions often reveal more about our assumptions than about the evidence we're examining. Every piece of evidence has two meanings: what it shows and what you're willing to see. So examine your own framework. Are you dismissing evidence because it doesn't fit your worldview? Are you accepting evidence for the same reason? The question isn't just what happened in ancient history. It's what you're allowing yourself to discover. But here's a deeper question. What if someone actively doesn't want you to discover it? Of all the claims surrounding giant research, one dominates the conversation: that the Smithsonian Institution deliberately destroyed evidence. Between 1880 and 1950, according to these allegations, the Smithsonian received hundreds of giant skeletons from archaeological excavations, mound explorations, and private collectors. Newspaper archives from this period document shipments explicitly. Reports state that remains of individuals measuring 7, 8, even 9 feet were carefully packaged and sent to Washington for study and preservation. Then, silence. Those specimens never appeared in published research, never entered public collections, never received scientific analysis. The pattern repeats across decades. A discovery is announced. Measurements are recorded. Local authorities or excavators arrange transport to the Smithsonian. Newspapers document the shipment. And then the skeleton disappears from the historical record entirely, as if it never existed. The Smithsonian's official position is straightforward. They deny possessing or ever possessing giant human remains. They suggest early reports may have been exaggerated measurements, misidentified animal bones, outright hoaxes. They note that not everything sent to the institution was preserved. Space constraints, preservation challenges, and determinations of scientific value meant many specimens were discarded or repatriated without study. This explanation deserves scrutiny. Is it plausible that hundreds of potentially revolutionary specimens remains that would rewrite understanding of human prehistory were all determined to have no scientific value? That every single one turned out to be measurement error or misidentification? The statistical improbability is striking. What we know about Smithsonian practices during this era complicates the picture further. The institution accumulated material at an extraordinary rate, often with haphazard cataloguing. Thousands of specimens remain in storage today, never studied, never displayed, their existence known only through fragmentary records. Items do get lost in vast institutions. Bureaucratic chaos can explain disappearances without requiring conspiracy. A widely circulated story claims a Supreme Court ruling forced the Smithsonian to release giant skeleton documentation. This story is completely fabricated. No such case ever existed. This hoax damaged legitimate investigation by making all Smithsonian criticism seem equally baseless. But legitimate questions remain. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act resulted in the return of thousands of Native American remains to tribal authorities, often without scientific study. Were unusually large skeletons among those repatriated remains returned to tribes and reburied according to cultural protocols? If so, the evidence is gone, not through suppression but through legal and ethical obligations. The Smithsonian has 1.5 million human remains in its collections. When asked about giant skeletons, they say we don't have any. They don't say we never received any. Here's the structural problem with the conspiracy theory. If giant skeletons existed, the Smithsonian had no obvious motive to suppress them. Such discoveries would be career-making for researchers, institution-elevating for the Smithsonian itself. Why destroy evidence that would bring prestige and funding? unless the motivation wasn't scientific, unless there were reasons beyond academic reputation. But before exploring those darker possibilities, we need to ask, were there individual researchers who pursued giant evidence and faced consequences? Did careers end over this? In 1922, an archaeologist published evidence of 8-foot skeletons from Patagonia. He never published again. The skeletons were never seen again. Neither was his career. This wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, researchers who investigated giant claims experienced professional marginalization, whether causally related or merely coincidental, remains a matter of interpretation. The pattern, however, is undeniable. Consider the archaeologists associated with the mound builder investigations. Several published accounts of unusually large skeletal remains in their preliminary reports, only to find their later work ignored or dismissed by the broader archaeological community. Field notes from this era reveal a telling pattern, mentions of unusual proportions that researchers were quietly advised by mentors to omit from final publications. In case after case, size anomalies documented in preliminary reports mysteriously disappeared from the final published versions. The academic culture of this era helps explain why. Emerging anthropological orthodoxy created intense pressure toward conformity. Extraordinary claims carried significant reputational risks. Senior researchers and institutions exercised editorial control over what got published, effectively gatekeeping the archaeological narrative. To deviate from accepted frameworks was to risk professional suicide. Alexander Braggeen serves as a cautionary tale. After investigating giant claims, he was labelled a pseudo-scientista designation that tainted all his other work by association. His fate illustrated a brutal reality. Pursue the wrong questions and your entire body of work becomes suspect. This raises a critical question. Were these researchers marginalized because their giant claims were unscientific, or did their marginalization prove that institutional science can't handle disruptive evidence? The counter-argument deserves consideration. Many of these researchers had methodological problems independent of their giant claims. They engaged in sensationalism, lacked rigorous documentation, or failed to meet the emerging standards of professional archaeology. Proving a causal connection between giant research and career damage is nearly impossible. Correlation doesn't prove conspiracy. Yet the absence of a smoking gun doesn't mean the effect wasn't real. Consider the incentive structure. If researchers observe that colleagues who pursue certain topics face marginalization, they'll avoid those topics regardless of whether the suppression is intentional. Self-censorship through incentive structure is more powerful than overt suppression. You don't need a conspiracy when career survival itself teaches researchers what questions are safe to ask. The result? An entire generation of researchers who learned to stay within acceptable boundaries, not because they were explicitly told to, but because they understood the price of curiosity. Individual researchers faced professional pressure, but what about entire research directions that were abandoned or never pursued? This leads us to examine how academic paradigms shape what questions get asked. Science prides itself on investigating every question, except the ones that make scientists uncomfortable. Those questions become invisible. This is a subtler form of suppression than actively hiding evidence, simply never investigating it in the first place. Academic disciplines develop paradigms, frameworks of accepted questions, methods, and theories that define what constitutes legitimate research. Once a paradigm is established, it becomes self-reinforcing, and anomalies that fall outside it are ignored or rationalized away. Thomas Kuhn explained this phenomenon. Normal science operates within established frameworks. Anomalies are dismissed or explained away until they become so overwhelming that they force a paradigm shift. But what if the anomalies never get investigated enough to become overwhelming? Consider the giant skeleton question through this lens. If mainstream anthropology decided early on that giant claims were either hoaxes or misidentified megafauna bones, then investigating them becomes not real science regardless of actual evidence. The question itself becomes illegitimate. The evidence for this institutional blindness is in the absence. How many PhD dissertations have been written on giant skeleton reports? How many peer-reviewed anthropological studies have seriously investigated the newspaper archive of giant discoveries? How much radiocarbon dating has been performed on unusually large skeletal remains to determine their age? The answer to most of these questions, zero or near zero. Is this absence because the evidence is worthless or because paradigms define worthlessness? The distinction matters. History offers cautionary tales. Meteorites were dismissed as superstition for centuries. Rocks couldn't fall from the sky. Continental drift was ridiculed for decades as geological fantasy. The idea that bacteria could cause ulcers was considered impossible until Barry Marshall infected himself with Helicobacter pylori to prove it. Institutional science has a mixed track record on paradigm-challenging evidence. Today's funding structures reinforce this problem. A grant application titled Investigating Giant Skeleton Reports in 19th-Century Newspapers would be rejected not necessarily due to conspiracy, but because it falls outside disciplinary norms. Peer reviewers, journal editors, and funding bodies enforce paradigms through gatekeeping, usually unconsciously. They're not suppressing truth, they're simply applying the standards of their field. But those standards define what counts as truth. The sobering reality, whether or not giants existed, current institutional structures make it nearly impossible to find out. The question itself has been rendered non-legitimate. No graduate student builds a career on it. No established researcher risks credibility on it. No institution funds it. The investigation never happens, not because evidence was examined and rejected, but because the question never got asked. This isn't necessarily malicious, but the effect is the same as if it were. Academic self-censorship is one barrier, but what about legal and governmental barriers? Were there laws or policies that prevented investigation or disclosure? This leads us to examine governmental involvement. In 1976, the National Park Service locked down an excavation site in Arizona. The official reason, cultural sensitivity. The unofficial reason was never recorded. Government agencies control much of America's archaeological landscape. The Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, and other federal entities manage sites where giants were allegedly discovered. Many sites on federal land have restricted access. Excavations require permits, creating centralized control over who investigates and what gets reported. The examples, if the claims are accurate, follow a pattern. Alleged discoveries on military bases that were immediately classified, researchers denied permits to excavate sites with potential giant evidence, federal rangers confiscating specimens from private individuals who discovered large bones on public land. Each incident taken alone has alternative explanations. Collectively, they suggest a structure of control. But why would governments care about giant skeletons? Several motives are plausible. Disruption to evolutionary narratives funded by federal science agencies. Conflicts with establishment histories promoted in public education. Protection of culturally sensitive Native American sites where NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, prohibits many excavations. Or simply bureaucratic conservatism agencies avoiding controversial claims that could invite public scrutiny or congressional questions. To be clear, many government suppression claims come from unreliable sources or lack documentation. Conspiracy theorists attribute elaborate motives to mundane bureaucratic decisions. But dismissing all such claims ignores genuine cases where federal agencies have been less than transparent about archaeological finds, often for legitimate reasons, protecting sites from looters, respecting indigenous rights, preventing sensationalism that could damage scientific research. The structural reality remains, government agencies have considerable power to control archaeological narratives through permits, access restrictions, and funding decisions. Whether they've used this power to suppress giant evidence specifically is disputed, but the infrastructure for such suppression exists. Documents obtained through FOIA requests reveal the bureaucratic machinery at work. Federal agencies' correspondence about controversial archaeological finds uses deliberately vague language, culturally sensitive materials, unverified claims requiring further study, site closure pending review. The terminology obscures rather than clarifies. Whether this is standard bureaucratic caution or strategic obfuscation depends on your interpretation. The truth is probably both. We've examined institutions and governments, but ultimately suppression requires human decisions. Who specifically benefited from giants disappearing from history? This leads us to Chapter 7, exploring motivations and beneficiaries. In 1912, scientists had just discovered that humans evolved from ape-like ancestors. The last thing they needed was evidence that humans used to be 10 feet tall. Perhaps the most plausible motive for suppressing giant evidence is simple. It disrupts evolutionary narratives. To understand why, we need to examine the intellectual climate during the period when most giant discoveries were allegedly made. Between 1850 and 1950, Darwinian evolution was newly established. Anthropology was emerging as a discipline. Scientists were constructing linear narratives of human origins and development stories that needed to be coherent, defensible, and comprehensible to a skeptical public and religious establishment. The evolutionary story, as it was being written, went like this. Small, primitive hominids gradually developed larger brains and more sophisticated culture over millions of years, culminating in modern humans. This narrative was elegant, progressive, and satisfying. It fit the Victorian notion of advancement. It made sense. Giants don't fit this narrative. If anatomically modern humans or closely related species existed in enormous proportions thousands of years ago, either as distinct populations or widespread variation, suggests human prehistory was more complex, diverse, and less linear than simplified evolutionary stories portrayed. It introduces messy complications into an already controversial theory that scientists were still defending against religious opposition. Evolutionary theory, properly understood, requires variation. Different populations adapt to different environments. Natural selection operates on diversity, but popular presentations of evolution, especially in its early decades, often flattened this complexity into simple progression, from small to large, from primitive to advanced, from ape to human in a clean ascending line. The specific conflicts are telling. If 7 to 9 foot humans coexisted with average height populations in ancient North America, as newspaper reports suggest, it challenges assumptions about migration patterns, population genetics, and the range of human variation. It raises questions that 19th century science wasn't equipped to answer. Modern paleoanthropology increasingly recognizes human evolution's complexity, multiple hominid species coexisting, interbreeding events between Neanderthals and modern humans, extensive morphological variation across populations. But in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, scientists were pursuing simplified linear models. They needed those models to gain institutional acceptance for evolution itself. Here's the key question. If giant skeletal evidence genuinely existed and was documented, did institutions suppress it consciously to protect evolutionary theory, or did researchers unconsciously filter it out because it didn't fit their interpretive framework? The distinction matters, but the effect is similar. Scientific paradigms handle anomalies in predictable ways, initially dismissed, then explained away, only acknowledged when evidence becomes overwhelming. Meteorites followed this pattern. Continental drift followed this pattern. Giant skeletal evidence, if real, may have followed it too, except the evidence never reached critical mass because it was filtered out before it could accumulate. This isn't claiming evolution is false. It's suggesting that oversimplified evolutionary narratives popular a century ago may have created blind spots regarding human diversity. Scientists weren't lying. They were simply seeing what their framework allowed them to see and ignoring what didn't fit. Evolution provides one motive, but what about religious institutions? Did religious authorities have incentives to suppress or promote giant evidence? This leads us to examine theological implications. The Bible says giants existed. The church says read it symbolically. Science says they couldn't have existed. Nobody asks why everyone's so uncomfortable with the obvious reading. On the surface, biblical literalists should embrace giant evidence as confirming Scripture's accuracy. The Old Testament explicitly describes Nephilim, Anakim, and other giants. Genesis 6 presents them as historical facts. Numbers 13 describes Israelite spies encountering giants in Canaan. Goliath stands over 9 feet tall. The textual evidence is clear. Yet many religious institutions have been quietly uncomfortable with giant claims. The reason becomes apparent when examining the theological implications. If giants existed as described in Genesis 6 as offspring of sons of God and daughters of men, it raises profoundly uncomfortable questions. Were angels material beings capable of procreation? What does angelite-human hybridization mean for doctrines of human nature, sin, and redemption? Did these hybrid beings have souls? Could they be saved? The literal reading creates theological complications that most denominations would rather avoid. Mainstream Christianity, particularly after the Enlightenment, increasingly interpreted Genesis 6 and other giant passages metaphorically or symbolically. This wasn't necessarily dishonest, it reflected sophisticated theological development, but it had consequences. By the 19th century, many religious institutions were accommodating scientific discoveries by reinterpreting scripture as allegorical, where it conflicted with emerging geology and evolutionary biology. Literal giants became casualties of this accommodation. The institutional dilemma cuts deeper, acknowledging giant evidence might vindicate biblical literalism, but it also empowers fundamentalist interpretations that challenge the authority of sophisticated, educated clergy and theologians who spent centuries developing nuanced hermeneutics. Confirming that Genesis 6 should be read literally opens questions about what else should be read, literally questions that institutional religion has carefully managed through interpretive tradition. The result? The Catholic Church, mainline Protestant denominations and academic theology generally minimized, spiritualized, or avoided giant references, not through conspiracy but through interpretive frameworks that marginalize literal readings. The irony is striking. Fundamentalist sects that should champion giant evidence often lack institutional resources, funding, or academic credibility to investigate it properly. Meanwhile, well-resourced religious institutions lack theological motivation to pursue evidence that would vindicate the interpretive approaches they've spent generations moving away from. Jewish tradition shows similar complexity. Rabbinic interpretation sometimes treated Nephilim and giants literally, sometimes symbolically, demonstrating internal diversity on the question. There was no single Jewish position, just as there's no single Christian one. Some modern creationist organizations do actively investigate giant claims, but their methodology and predetermined conclusions are often dismissed by mainstream science. This creates a closed loop. The only people seriously investigating are ideologically preconvinced, which ensures their findings aren't taken seriously, which ensures no one else investigates. Scientific and religious institutions had ideological reasons for discomfort. But what about national and cultural identity? Did giants threaten narratives about who built civilizations? This leads us to examine cultural ownership questions. Proving Native Americans built the mounds was an anti-racist victory. If the mounds contained giant skeletons, proving it now feels like a racist loss. Truth became politically unacceptable. 19th century America confronted a mystery. Thousands of massive earthen mounds across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, sophisticated earthworks that settlers couldn't reconcile with their perceptions of contemporary Native American societies. Rather than question their assumptions, they invented an explanation. The mound builder myth theorized that an advanced, possibly white, possibly European-descended lost race, built these structures thousands of years ago before being destroyed or displaced by the ancestors of modern Native Americans. This wasn't innocent speculation. It was ideologically convenient. If Native Americans weren't the true original inhabitants, their dispossession under manifest destiny became easier to justify. Many early mound excavations reported giant skeletons. Proponents of the mound builder myth seized on these reports as evidence of a separate, advanced race. If giants built the mounds, were they European? Atlantean? A lost civilization predating Native Americans? The question served political purposes. By the late 19th century, serious archaeology dismantled these racist fantasies. Cyrus Thomas's exhaustive work for the Bureau of American Ethnology definitively proved that Native American cultures built the mounds. The lost race theory collapsed under archaeological evidence. This was a genuine anti-racist victory for science, proving indigenous peoples' sophisticated civilizations against white supremacist narratives that portrayed them as primitive. But here's the complication. After fighting to establish that Native Americans built the mounds, acknowledging that some excavations yielded unusually large skeletons risked reviving the discredited racist theories institutions had worked to dismantle. The institutional dilemma becomes clear. Genuine giant evidence, if it existed, couldn't be acknowledged without potentially weaponizing it for racist ideology. The safest course was silence. Not because scientists were hiding truth maliciously, but because truth had become politically dangerous. This isn't hypothetical speculation. The pattern appears in the historical record. Early mound excavation reports mentioning large skeletons that later disappeared from official summaries, skeletal collections that were documented in field notes but never formally catalogued, measurements that weren't included in final publications. Then came NAGPRAth, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Beginning in the 1990s and continuing through the 2000s, remains excavated from mounds were repatriated to tribes. Any unusually large skeletons returned with them, removed from scientific access. This wasn't conspiracy, it was cultural rights and sovereignty legally and morally justified. but it had consequences. Modern scientific analysis became impossible. Radiocarbon dating, DNA analysis, morphometric studies, none of these could be performed on repatriated remains. Native American tribes were protecting culturally sensitive materials from a history of exploitation and desecration. No one can fault them. Yet the effect remains. If giant evidence existed in those collections, it's now beyond investigation. This creates profound moral complexity. Should scientific inquiry override indigenous cultural rights? Of course not. But should historical truth be subordinated to avoiding ideological weaponization? That's harder to answer. The Mound Builder controversy shows how scientific truth can become politically unacceptable, not because institutions are evil, but because history has made certain truths dangerous. Cultural politics provides another suppression motive, but these all assume coordinated action. What if suppression wasn't coordinated but emergent? This leads us to examine systems theory approaches. You don't need a conspiracy when everyone independently decides the same question isn't worth asking. Perhaps the most sophisticated suppression theory doesn't require conspiracy at all. Instead, it proposes that giant evidence disappeared through distributed institutional behavior responding to aligned incentives. This is systems theory applied to historical silence. Complex outcomes don't require conscious coordination if incentive structures align. Consider how multiple institutions, universities, museums, governmental agencies, publishers, religious organizations each had independent reasons to minimize or ignore giant evidence. Universities wanted respectable science that attracted funding and talented researchers. Museums wanted uncontroversial displays that educated the public without generating conflict. Government agencies wanted to avoid cultural conflicts with indigenous peoples and the political complications of challenging established narratives. Publishers wanted credible scholarship that enhanced their reputations. Religious institutions wanted to avoid theological complications that divided congregations. None conspired together, but all reached similar conclusions. Giant claims were problematic. Better ignored. Distributed suppression operates organically. Researchers self-censor, knowing papers on giants won't be published and will harm their careers. Editors reject submissions without conspiracy, simply applying quality standards that reflect disciplinary norms. Museum curators store anomalous specimens without cataloguing them, not actively hiding, but not highlighting either. Journalists stop reporting giant discoveries because editors dismiss them as sensational pseudoscience. This distributed model is more effective than coordinated conspiracy. It's organic, self-reinforcing, and leaves no smoking gun evidence, no secret meetings, no explicit orders, just aligned incentives producing uniform behavior. History offers parallels. Continental drift faced distributed suppression before the 1960s, not conspiracy, just widespread institutional resistance from geologists whose careers were built on static continents. Bacterial ulcers faced similar resistance before the 1980s, not conspiracy, just doctors and pharmaceutical companies invested in stress-based theories. Institutional sexual abuse went unreported for decades before the 2000s, not conspiracy, just interlocking incentives that made silence individually rational. These weren't conspiracies. They were widespread institutional failures to investigate uncomfortable truths. Here's the profound question. If suppression operates through distributed incentives rather than coordination, how would we even detect it? What does evidence of absence look like versus absence of evidence? The distinction might be impossible to determine from inside the system. If distributed suppression of giant evidence occurred, the results would look exactly like what we observe. Abundant historical claims from the 19th and early 20th centuries. Zero modern evidence, no conspiracy, no villains, no documents proving coordination. Just silence. Silence created by hundreds of independent decisions, each individually rational, collectively producing a gap in knowledge. We've explored why institutions might suppress evidence, but what if the problem isn't suppression but misidentification? This leads us to Chapter 8, examining scientific explanations for giant claims. Follow the silence. Whoever benefited from giants disappearing is whoever you should question first. Who benefited from giants disappearing from historical narratives? Scientific institutions maintained simplified evolutionary stories. Religious institutions avoided theological complications. Governments controlled cultural heritage narratives. Academic careers remained protected from controversial topics that could invite ridicule or funding loss. But who lost? Humanity's understanding of its own past. Indigenous peoples whose oral histories of ancient giants were dismissed as mythology. Researchers whose genuine findings were ignored or suppressed. The public's access to complete archaeological records. Benefit analysis doesn't prove motive. People don't always act in their interests, and institutions rarely consciously calculate such benefits. But examining who gained and who lost from the erasure of giants from mainstream discourse reveals power structures. It shows whose knowledge counts as legitimate, whose questions are worth investigating, and whose stories get written into official history. From institutional motives to scientific explanations, what do skeptics say about giant claims? The simplest explanation for missing giant skeletons: they were never giant, never skeletal, and often never really found at all. Let's present the strongest skeptical arguments against giant existence, because intellectual honesty requires confronting the best counter-arguments. First, misidentified megafauna. Mammoth, mastodon, and other Pleistocene megafauna bones, when partially exposed or fragmentary, can resemble enormous human bones to untrained observers. This isn't speculation, it's documented. Mammoth femurs have been mistaken for human femurs. Mastodon skulls with their nasal cavities positioned centrally have been mistaken for giant cyclops skulls. This literally happened in ancient Greece and influenced mythology. Many alleged giant bones, when properly analysed by trained archaeologists, proved to be from extinct animals. The pattern is consistent across cases where specimens were actually preserved and studied. Second, hoaxes. The 19th century was rife with archaeological fraud. The Cardiff Giant, a carved stone statue buried and discovered, attracted thousands of paying visitors. Various sideshow giant skeletons were constructed from multiple animal bones, plaster, and creative assembly. These weren't isolated incidents. Hoaxes were commercially motivated. Giants attracted audiences willing to pay admission. Third, journalistic standards. Newspapers in the 19th century printed sensational stories with minimal fact-checking. Local gazettes especially loved giant discoveries, citing local news that sold papers. Reporters rarely verified claims, visited sites, or consulted experts. If someone claimed to find a giant, it got printed. Fourth, measurement error and exaggeration. Excavators used imprecise methods. They estimated rather than measured. They exaggerated for effect. A skeleton measuring 6'6" becomes over 7 feet in the report, which becomes nearly 8 feet in retelling. The telephone game effect compounds. Large skeleton becomes giant skeleton, becomes enormous giant across successive retellings. Fifth, individual gigantism versus giant races. Medical conditions like pituitary gigantism can produce individuals reaching 79 feet tall. These are documented in modern populations. If such individuals died in ancient populations, their remains might be interpreted as evidence of giant races rather than pathological individual variation. 6. Absence of evidence. If thousands of giant skeletons were genuinely discovered, where are they? Why haven't any survived to the present? Even accounting for poor preservation practices in the 19th century, 0 specimens seemed statistically impossible if the discoveries were genuine. This is perhaps the skeptic's strongest argument. 7th, institutional incompetence, not conspiracy. Maybe specimens were sent to museums, poorly catalogued, stored incorrectly, and lost through ordinary bureaucratic negligence. Museums lose things. Archives burn. Collections get misplaced. Explaining the absence doesn't require conspiracy, just normal institutional dysfunction over a century. The skeptical explanation is elegant: normal human error, commercial motivation, journalistic sensationalism, exaggeration in retelling, misidentification of animal bones, plus individual cases of gigantism interpreted as racial characteristics. No conspiracy needed. No mass delusion required. Just ordinary human fallibility. Skeptics make strong points about misidentification and hoaxes, but can all evidence be explained this way? But what about evidence that doesn't fit neat skeptical explanations? This leads us to examine anomalies that resist debunking. Debunking 90% of giant claims doesn't debunk 100%. The remaining 10% is where truth lives, uncomfortable and ignored. Skeptical explanations work for most giant claims, but not all. Some evidence doesn't fit comfortable dismissals as misidentified megafauna or hoaxes. Consider the Lovelock Cave case. Yes, the mummified remains found, they were large but within extreme normal human range, perhaps 6 to 7 feet, but the sandals require explanation. 15 to 22-inch sandals were documented at the site. Were they ceremonial, worn over other footwear for winter conditions, or made for genuinely large feet? The Paiute oral tradition adds complexity. Their stories describe specific physical details: red hair, unusual height that match what was actually found in the cave. This suggests cultural memory of real encounters, not pure fantasy. Some newspaper reports included details harder to dismiss: measurements, witness lists, institutional attribution, cases where county officials, historical society members, and local physicians signed affidavits describing specific skeletal measurements exceeding 8 feet, reports documenting unusual anatomical features: double rows of teeth, 6 fingers, elongated skulls that don't match any megafauna. Here's the statistical problem. Even if 90% of reports were errors, hoaxes, or misidentifications, are we confident 100% were? At what threshold does dismissing everything become its own form of bias? Photographs from formal archaeological contexts complicate the narrative. University expeditions, museum displays, skeletal remains of notable size with unclear provenance but unclear fabrication as well. These aren't sideshow exhibits, they're institutional documentation, however ambiguous. Modern discoveries add wrinkles. The 2007 find in Ecuador of unusually large skeletal remains contested. Some researchers claiming over 7 feet, others claiming normal size with measurement errors. Bulgarian excavations have documented individuals over 7 feet in ancient populations. Genetic studies finding height-associated alleles in ancient DNA suggest greater historical height variation than contemporary populations display. Perhaps the truth lies in a middle ground often ignored, the partial truth hypothesis. Maybe reports contained kernels of reality: genuinely tall populations averaging 7 to 7.5 feet, rare individuals with gigantism reaching 8 to 9 feet that got exaggerated through retelling into impossible 12 to 15-foot giants. This middle ground makes sense, but it satisfies neither side. Debates polarize around all true versus all false. Partially true, greatly exaggerated, doesn't provide the narrative clarity people want. Believers want vindication. Skeptics want dismissal. Neither wants. It's complicated. Yet complicated is often accurate. The uncomfortable reality: some evidence genuinely resists neat explanation. Not proof of giants in the fantastical sense. Not easily explained away as simple error either. Evidence that sits in that uncertain middle ground where most historical truth actually lives: fragmentary, contested, ambiguous. Archaeological context was lost. Specimens disappeared. Measurements were imprecise. Documentation was incomplete. We're left with partial records of something that might have been partially real, exaggerated by the limitations of 19th century investigation and storytelling. This isn't satisfying, but it's probably closer to truth than either extreme. Some evidence resists explanation, but what could modern science tell us if given access to specimens? This leads us to examine what DNA and modern forensics could reveal. We can extract DNA from 40,000-year-old Neanderthal teeth. If a single giant skeleton existed, we could sequence its genome in weeks. Someone, somewhere, has made sure we can't. Modern genetic and forensic analysis could definitively resolve the giant question if only specimens were available. Ancient DNA, aDNA analysis is now routine. Extracting and sequencing genetic material from bones thousands of years old reveals individual ancestry, population relationships, health conditions, and physical characteristics. We've sequenced Neanderthals, Denisovans, archaic hominids from 400,000 years ago. The technology exists. The capability is proven. What could giant DNA reveal? If giants were a distinct hominid, species like Neanderthals or Denisovans, their DNA would show clear evolutionary divergence from Homo sapiens. We could place them on the human family tree, determine when lineages split, identify how much genetic exchange occurred with other hominids. This would be revolutionary. If giants were anatomically modern Homo sapiens with genetic variants producing exceptional size, we could identify specific alleles and mutations responsible. We could determine whether these variants still exist in modern populations at low frequencies or whether they've been lost through genetic drift. We could understand the evolutionary history of human height variation. If reported giants were actually normal humans, misidentified or exaggerated, DNA would show typical human genetic variation indistinguishable from modern populations. This would settle the question definitively. Height genetics provides context. Modern genome-wide association studies GWAS have identified hundreds of genetic variants affecting height, explaining much of the variation within and between populations. Ancient populations may have possessed height-associated variants no longer common today. If ancestral humans carried different combinations of height alleles, 7 to 8 foot individuals might have been less rare than contemporary populations suggest. Gigantism causing mutations are diagnostic. Pituitary adenomas, growth hormone receptor mutations, and other genetic conditions produce exceptional height. If giants were simply individuals with these conditions, their DNA would show characteristic mutations. Crucially, finding such mutations would disprove the giant race hypothesis. These would be isolated pathological cases, not breeding populations maintaining genetic distinctiveness. Mitochondrial DNA analysis could reveal maternal lineages, showing whether giants represent distinct populations or are embedded within normal human lineages. If giant mtDNA clustered separately from contemporary human haplogroups, it would suggest population distinctiveness. If intermixed, it would suggest variation within normal populations. Bone isotope analysis could reveal diet and migration patterns. Were unusually large individuals eating differently, suggesting distinct cultural practices or subsistence strategies? Did they migrate from different geographic origins? Stable isotopes in bone collagen preserve this information for thousands of years. Dental morphology and enamel preserve ancient DNA exceptionally well. Teeth reveal evolutionary relationships through morphological traits and genetic material. A single tooth could answer decades of speculation. The tragedy is acute. If even a few giant skeletal remains had been preserved and made available for modern analysis, we could definitively answer whether they represent distinct species, genetic variants within Homo sapiens, pathological gigantism, or misidentifications. The technology exists. The methodology is proven. Only specimens are missing. Some indigenous American tribes may possess repatriated remains that include unusually large individuals, but NAGPRA restrictions prevent scientific access. This creates genuine ethical complexity, cultural rights versus scientific inquiry. Neither side is wholly right or wrong, but the effect is continued ambiguity where clarity could exist. DNA could resolve the question, but in its absence, what do comparative studies of human variation tell us about whether giant populations are plausible? This leads us to examine human biodiversity. We know Neanderthals existed because their DNA survives in us. If giants existed but went extinct without admixture, we'd never find genetic proof. They'd simply be forgotten. Human physical diversity has been dramatically reduced over time, potentially including height extremes we no longer recognize as possible. Consider documented height variation across populations. Northern European populations average significantly taller than Southeast Asian populations, with genetic and environmental factors producing these differences over thousands of years. This variation exists within our species today. How much greater might it have been in the past? Humans have undergone rapid evolutionary change in the last 10,000 years. Lactose tolerance emerged. Altitude adaptations developed in Tibetan populations. Skin pigmentation shifted in response to UV exposure and vitamin D requirements. Evolution continues and significant change can occur quickly. Population bottlenecks matter. The Toba eruption 70,000 years ago, various Ice Age population contractions, these events dramatically reduced human genetic diversity. We've lost genetic variants that existed in ancestral populations. Could height extreme variants have been among those lost? Ancient populations were documented as notably tall. The Tehuelche people of Patagonia averaged 6 feet when encountered by Europeans, exceptional for indigenous Americans. Germanic tribes were described by Romans as exceptionally tall. Tutsi populations in Africa average notable height even today. These examples prove that populations can maintain distinctive height characteristics. Could ancient populations have included groups averaging 7 feet or more through genetic adaptation, founder effects in isolated populations, or unique selective pressures? Island populations developed distinctive traits through isolation. Could island gigantism have produced unusually tall human populations now extinct? Small populations with distinctive traits disappear through war, disease, or absorption into larger populations. They leave no genetic traces in surviving peoples. Their uniqueness vanishes. Here's the hypothesis. Perhaps giants weren't a separate species, but represented the extreme end of human height variation in populations that no longer exist, either through extinction or genetic admixture. This explains why giants don't appear in modern DNA. They weren't separate enough to leave distinctive markers like Neanderthals or Denisovans, but were distinct enough to be remarkable to populations encountering them. If true, we wouldn't find giant DNA because it was never categorically different, just statistically extreme variation that fell outside the range we now consider normal. That variation disappeared when those populations disappeared. This is scientifically plausible, but it still doesn't fully explain the suppression. Why does the question remain taboo? Why the institutional silence? Genetic diversity could explain giants as extreme variants, but this still doesn't fully explain why investigating the question became professionally dangerous. This leads us to Chapter 9, examining deeper reasons for erasure. Forensic science can reconstruct entire lives from bone fragments, but only if someone lets them look. Modern forensic anthropology could definitively answer the giant question. From skeletal remains, forensic analysis determines age at death, sex, pathologies, injuries sustained during life, dietary patterns from isotope analysis, ancestry, height estimation with high precision, whether proportions match gigantism pathology or represent normal scaled variation. Without specimens, every debate remains speculative. Believers point to historical accounts. Skeptics point to absence of physical evidence. Both talk past each other, neither able to prove their case definitively. The forensic vacuum benefits both sides. Believers can maintain faith in the absence of debunking evidence. Skeptics can maintain dismissal in the absence of confirming evidence. Neither has to confront potentially challenging data that might complicate their narrative. This creates a strange equilibrium where ambiguity serves everyone's interests except those actually seeking truth. Perhaps the real suppression isn't hiding evidence, but ensuring the right questions never get asked with the right tools. If no one ever applies proper forensic analysis to the remaining evidence, whatever fragments might still exist in storage, private collections, or repatriated to tribes, then truth remains safely ambiguous. Convenient for everyone, except history. With examined evidence, suppression, and science now, we must ask, why would erasing giants from history matter so much? We built skyscrapers, so we must be smarter than people who built Göbekli Tepe, unless they built it better. Then we have a problem. Giants threaten the fundamental narrative of human progress that underlies modern civilization's self-understanding. The dominant historical meta-narrative is simple and satisfying. Humans evolved from primitive to sophisticated, from superstitious to rational, from weak to powerful, continuously progressing upward. This narrative positions modern civilization as the pinnacle of human development. Everything before was inferior. Everything ahead will be superior. Progress is inevitable, linear, and directional. This story became culturally essential during the Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution. It justified colonialism as civilizing primitives. It justified industrial capitalism as technological progress. It justified Western cultural dominance as representing the most advanced civilization humanity had achieved. The narrative wasn't just descriptive, it was ideological infrastructure. Evolutionary theory reinforced this, from simple organisms to complex ones, from hominids to humans, from savage to civilized, pointing toward progress, advancement, improvement. Darwin described evolution as a branching tree, but popular interpretation flattened it into a ladder with modern humans at the top. What do giants do to this narrative? If large, powerful humanoids existed in ancient times and subsequently disappeared, it suggests regression, not progression. If ancient peoples possessed capabilities we've lost, building massive structures with precision we struggle to replicate, achieving unusual physical prowess, it undermines progressive history. This creates profound cognitive dissonance. Accepting giants means accepting that ancient peoples might have been more capable in some ways than modern peoples. That's uncomfortable for cultures invested in superiority narratives. History has been sanitized to maintain linear progress. Ancient sophistication is downplayed. Ancient technological achievements are attributed to slave labor and primitive methods, even when such explanations strain credibility. Ancient knowledge is dismissed as lucky superstition. Examples proliferate. Ancient precision in megalithic construction stones cut and fitted so precisely that modern engineers struggle to explain how is dismissed as patient effort. Ancient astronomical knowledge that required understanding of planetary motion, eclipses, and precession is attributed to centuries of observation, without acknowledging the mathematical sophistication required to interpret such observations. Ancient mathematical achievements, like the Antikythera mechanism, a 2,000-year-old analog computer array, treated as anomalies rather than evidence of widespread capability. Giants, if acknowledged, would necessitate rethinking civilization itself. Maybe history isn't linear progress, but cycles of rise and fall. Maybe ancient peoples possessed knowledge we've lost. Maybe humanity has been more diverse and capable than progressive narratives admit. The psychological stakes are high. If the progress narrative collapses, what justifies modern civilization's organization, values, and power structures? If we're not the pinnacle, not the inevitable culmination of historical development, then our current arrangements are contingent, not necessary. Contestable, not inevitable. This doesn't mean progress is false. It means narratives requiring everything ancient to be primitive create blind spots regarding ancient capabilities, including potentially the existence of exceptionally large and strong human populations who possessed capabilities we find threatening to acknowledge. Progress narratives explain why modern civilization might resist giants, but what about religious narratives? Why would acknowledging giants challenge faith? This leads us to examine theological implications more deeply. If angels could father children, Christianity has to answer, did Jesus die for the Nephilim? Every theologian who asked found themselves silenced. Giants create theological problems far deeper than simple literalism. The Genesis 6 implication is unavoidable. If angels or divine beings, sons of God, procreated with humans producing Nephilim, it suggests material divine beings capable of physical reproduction. This is profoundly challenging for religions conceiving of God and angels as purely spiritual. The theological complexity cascades. What is the nature of the divine? Can spiritual beings manifest physically with reproductive capability? What does angelitude hybridization mean for human souls, free will, and moral responsibility? Were Nephilim damned by nature or by choice? If by nature, does that contradict free will? If by choice, were they morally responsible for their hybrid origin? Modern theology generally avoids these questions by spiritualizing or dismissing the relevant passages. But this wasn't always the approach. Early Christian writings took angelitude procreation literally. Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, various church fathers built elaborate demonology around fallen angels and their offspring. These texts describe the Watchers angels who descended to mate with human women and the giants who resulted, teaching humanity forbidden knowledge of warfare, cosmetics, and sorcery. This created problems for Christian doctrine. If evil exists because of angelic rebellion and hybrid offspring, does that diminish human moral responsibility for sin? If the flood was necessary to destroy human hybrids corrupting creation, does that justify divine genocide? If giants carry angelic genetics, are they salvageable through Christ's redemption, or are they ontologically unredeemable? These questions challenged comfortable theodicy explanations of why evil exists and soteriology theology of salvation. The answers threaten doctrinal stability. Institutional Christianity, particularly after Augustine, increasingly spiritualized Genesis 6 to avoid these complications. Sons of God became Seth's righteous lineage. Daughters of men became Cain's wicked line. Nephilim became metaphor for wickedness, not literal hybrids. This interpretation had the advantage of avoiding all the uncomfortable questions about angelic physicality and hybrid natures. Physical giants are theologically safer when they're purely human. Giant humans are just genetic variation usual, but not doctrinally challenging. They don't require explaining angelic reproduction, spiritual physical hybrids, or whether non-human intelligent beings can be saved. Mormon theology offers instructive contrast. Mormonism uniquely embraces material divine beings and a pre-earth existence. This theological framework allows for literal Nephilim interpretation without the same doctrinal complications that trouble traditional Christianity. The correlation is notable. Theological frameworks allowing material divinity more easily accommodate literal giants. Giants threatened to reopen theological questions most religious institutions had closed: the nature of divine beings, the physicality of angels, the possibility of spiritual physical hybrids, and the implications for human nature and salvation. Closing those questions required closing inquiry into giants themselves. Religious institutions had theological reasons to suppress giants, but what about indigenous peoples themselves? How do they view their own oral histories about giants? This leads us to examine indigenous perspectives. When Native Americans said, "Our ancestors fought giants," anthropologists heard, "These people can't distinguish fact from fiction. The giants weren't the only thing erased." Dismissing giant accounts enabled broader dismissal of indigenous knowledge systems. This wasn't accidental, it was structural. Western colonialism required viewing indigenous peoples as primitive. Their knowledge had to be superstition. Their histories had to be mythology. This framework justified conquest, civilizing the savage, replacing primitive beliefs with rational knowledge, bringing enlightenment to darkness. If indigenous knowledge systems were valid, colonialism's moral justification collapsed. Indigenous oral histories about giants were initially reported as curious, ethnographic data by early explorers and settlers. But once serious archaeology emerged as a discipline, those same accounts were reclassified as primitive mythology. The interpretive double standard is striking. When indigenous peoples described warfare patterns, migration routes, or subsistence practices, their accounts were treated as valid ethnographic sources. When they described giants, those same accounts became mere legend. Why? What made giants uniquely incredible compared to other indigenous testimony? The answer: giants challenged Western narratives. If indigenous oral histories about giants were accurate, it meant indigenous knowledge systems preserved historical truth better than Western historians assumed. It meant oral tradition could be reliable across centuries or millennia. It meant indigenous peoples weren't primitive tellers of fantasies, but sophisticated historians using different methodological frameworks. Consider the Paiute accounts of the Si-Te-Cah haired giants who lived in Lovelock Cave. When archaeological excavations found red-haired mummified remains and exceptionally large sandals matching specific details in Paiute oral tradition, this should have validated their historical methodology. Instead, the matching was explained away. The remains were within normal human variation, though at the extreme upper range. The sandals were ceremonial with no supporting evidence. The red hair was environmental degradation, though some samples showed natural red pigmentation. Every confirmation was reinterpreted to avoid the conclusion indigenous oral tradition had preserved accurate historical information across centuries. NAGPA created tragic complexity. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act rightfully protected indigenous cultural heritage from exploitation and returned ancestral remains to tribes. But any giant remains in those collections became unavailable for modern scientific study. This wasn't tribal suppression, it was cultural protection correcting historical injustice. Yet the effect is that evidence, if it existed, became inaccessible. Indigenous perspectives on the controversy vary. Some tribal historians affirm their giant traditions as literal, physical historical truth. Others view them as symbolic or spiritual teachings rather than physical descriptions. Still others resist external investigation as continuation of colonial exploitation, their knowledge extracted for Western benefit without respect or reciprocity. This creates genuine epistemological challenge. Western science demands physical evidence, reproducible results, peer review. Indigenous knowledge systems value oral testimony, spiritual understanding, and traditional teaching. How do we honour both without dismissing either? The bind is real. If we accept indigenous giant accounts as historical, we challenge Western archaeological frameworks. If we dismiss them as mythology, we perpetuate colonial disrespect for indigenous knowledge systems. There's no comfortable resolution. But perhaps discomfort is appropriate when confronting how knowledge systems themselves are shaped by power. Indigenous knowledge was dismissed, partly through the giant question, but there's a deeper issue. What if giants threaten our understanding of human nature itself? This leads us to examine anthropological and philosophical implications. We fought too hard to establish human equality to risk discovering we were more different than we thought. Truth took a back seat to safety. Giants challenge comfortable assumptions about human nature and human universality. This goes deeper than physical variation. It threatens foundational concepts of modern ethics and social science. Anthropological dogma holds that humans are fundamentally similar across cultures and time. We vary in culture, language, and custom, but not in essential nature. This universality grounds human rights, ethics, and social science. All humans have equal moral worth because we're all fundamentally the same. What if giants existed as a distinct population or variant? The implications cascade. If ancient humans included populations dramatically different in physical capacity size, strength, potentially lifespan or cognitive differences, those that challenge human universality, were giants human in the same moral sense with the same cognitive capacities and moral status? This question makes people profoundly uncomfortable, and for good reason. Historical anxieties about human variation produced horrors. Colonialism justified itself partly through racial pseudoscience claiming fundamental differences between populations. Modern science corrected this, establishing that human genetic variation is minor, all populations are fundamentally similar, racial categories are social constructs without biological foundation. But giants, if real, would represent significant variation, not racial variation. That's discredited pseudoscience. But perhaps subspecies-level difference like Neanderthals or Denisovans. They were clearly distinct from Homo sapiens yet interfertile with us. Were they human? Do they have the same moral status we attribute to modern humans? Modern ethics assumes human universality. Humans have equal moral worth. Giants, if distinct enough, challenge this foundation. The question threatens the philosophical basis of universal human rights. Even acknowledging the possibility of significantly variant human populations risks reviving discredited hierarchical racial theories. If some ancient populations were dramatically different, doesn't that suggest populations can differ in fundamental ways? The question opens doors better left closed. Institutional science might avoid giant evidence not through conspiracy, but through reasonable fear. Acknowledging dramatic human variation could be ideologically weaponized by those seeking to justify inequality. History demonstrates this danger repeatedly. This presents a genuine dilemma. Truth-seeking might uncover facts that are socially dangerous. Do we investigate fully, risking misuse of findings, or avoid certain investigations to prevent harm? The question has no easy answer. It applies to many controversial research areas: intelligence differences, behavioral genetics, any topic touching human variation. Giants became one casualty of this caution. We protected equality by restricting inquiry. Whether that trade-off was worth it depends on what we lost. We've explored multiple reasons giants had to disappear. Now we must ask, what does their erasure cost us? This leads to Chapter 10, our conclusion. The most effective censorship isn't burning books. It's making certain questions so ridiculous nobody asks them. Those who control what's remembered control something far deeper than facts. They control identity, possibility, imagination itself. And forgetting, strange as it sounds, is often more powerful than remembering. What's forgotten doesn't just become unknown, it becomes unthinkable. Giants, whether they walked this earth or lived only in myth, represented human possibility. They embodied wonder. Their presence in stories suggested a world larger, stranger, more magnificent than the ordinary. Their erasure from serious consideration made history smaller, more mundane, more controllable. Power doesn't maintain itself through force alone. It maintains itself by limiting what we can imagine. Making certain pasts unthinkable makes certain futures unimaginable. We're not claiming giants definitely existed. But consider this. Whether they did or not, the fact that asking the question became culturally unspeakable reveals just how thoroughly modern institutions shape what we're allowed to wonder about. Which raises one final question. What do we do with that knowledge now? You can decide the evidence isn't enough. But you can't decide there is no evidence. It exists. Someone has to explain it. Before we go further, sit with the totality of what we've examined. Global cultural traditions describing giants with remarkable consistency. Ancient texts from civilizations that never contacted each other treating giants as historical, not mythological. Newspaper archives documenting hundreds of skeletal discoveries across continents. architectural anomalies suggesting capabilities beyond conventional understanding, biological plausibility of human height variation far beyond current norms, institutional behavior consistent with suppression, or at minimum, uncomfortable silence, missing specimens that should exist if reports were genuine, indigenous testimonies dismissed through colonial epistemic violence. The pattern exists. The question is what it means. You're left with three possibilities. First, giants existed as described and evidence was systematically suppressed through distributed institutional behavior spanning museums, universities and governmental bodies. Second, giants didn't exist, but the volume of reports reflects genuine human encounters with unusual phenomena, exceptionally tall individuals, megafauna remains, cultural others that were encoded and exaggerated through mythology. Third, giants never existed, and all reports represent misidentification, hoax, and error at massive scale across cultures and centuries. None of these options is comfortable. Accepting the first requires believing institutions are systematically unreliable, that knowledge gatekeepers actively or passively suppress inconvenient discoveries. Accepting the second requires believing ancient testimony, while unreliable literally, preserves real information encoded in symbolic language we've forgotten how to read. Accepting the third requires believing thousands of witnesses across history were wrong about what they observed, that newspaper editors, archaeologists and entire communities participated in or fell victim to coordinated delusion. Each possibility challenges something we want to believe about human institutions, about ancient peoples, about historical testimony. Our goal was never to prove giants existed. It was to demonstrate that the question deserves serious investigation rather than reflexive dismissal. Whether giants walk this earth or not, the pattern of evidence and institutional response reveals something vital about how history is constructed, who controls narratives, and what questions are permitted in public discourse. Consider this carefully. Even if you conclude giants didn't exist, does the institutional silence around the question concern you? Even if you decide all reports were errors, does the volume and consistency of those errors itself demand explanation? If hundreds of newspapers publish fabrications, why? If indigenous peoples worldwide independently invented similar myths, what does that reveal about human psychology or forgotten history? The evidence may not prove giants, but it proves something. A gap exists between what people reported and what institutions acknowledge, between what ancient texts describe and what modern authorities permit us to consider seriously, between what's in museum basements and what's displayed publicly. That gap is real. Explaining it away is harder than it appears. And now we must ask, what does living with that gap cost us? Being certain you're right feels powerful. Being uncertain what's true is actually stronger. It means you're still thinking. There's a trap on both sides of this question, and both traps offer comfort. The believer's trap works like this. You accept giants as proven fact despite ambiguous evidence. This gives you the rush of possessing hidden knowledge, of seeing what others miss. But it makes you vulnerable to manipulation by charlatans selling giant narratives. It alienates you from mainstream discourse. It risks forming your identity around beliefs that might be wrong. You become the person who knows, and that certainty closes you off from learning. The skeptic's trap is equally seductive. You dismiss all giant evidence as hoax, misidentification, primitive misunderstanding. This gives you the satisfaction of intellectual superiority, of being the rational one in a room of fools. But it makes you miss genuine anomalies worth investigating. It reinforces institutional gatekeeping. It makes you complicit in epistemic closure, the shutting down of questions before they're properly asked. You become the person who knows better, and that certainty closes you off from wonder. Both positions avoid the same thing, the discomfort of uncertainty. The social costs run deep. Giant belief leads to marginalization, association with fringe communities, ridicule from educated peers. You become the person at parties nobody wants to engage. Giant skepticism means complicity with institutional suppression, dismissing indigenous knowledge systems, participating in historical erasure. You become the person who defends power without examining whether power deserves defense. There's a third option, principled agnosticism. Not wishy-washy uncertainty, committed acknowledgement that available evidence doesn't support definitive conclusion. Admitting we don't know whether giants existed. acknowledging both evidence and counter-evidence, respecting both indigenous testimony and scientific skepticism, critiquing institutional behaviour without claiming conspiracy, remaining genuinely open to new evidence. Agnosticism is psychologically harder than certainty. It requires living with ambiguity, resisting the comfort of conclusive answers, maintaining intellectual humility when certainty would feel so much better. But history rewards it. Continental drift was dismissed as pseudoscience until it wasn't. Bacteria causing ulcers was laughed at until proven. Meteorites falling from the sky was considered superstition until specimens accumulated. Heliocentrism was heresy until observation demanded acceptance. Premature certainty stopped investigation. Openness to uncertainty allowed truth to emerge. What if giants represent a question current evidence cannot definitively answer? What if the intellectually honest position is simply, I don't know? Practically, this means supporting serious investigation, demanding institutional transparency, respecting diverse knowledge systems, critiquing suppression without claiming to know what was suppressed. Certainty feels like strength. On controversial questions with ambiguous evidence, uncertainty is actually the braver position, which raises a deeper question. What does the giant mystery teach us about who writes history and who controls what we're allowed to question? History isn't written by victors. It's written by people with credentials, funding, and institutional positions. Everyone else is just telling stories. History isn't discovered. It's constructed through processes of selection, interpretation, emphasis, and omission. And those processes are controlled by specific groups with specific interests. Academic historians and archaeologists hold institutional authority. Museums choose what to display and how to frame it. Publishers decide which books and journals get produced. Educational systems determine curricula. Media shapes popular historical understanding. These aren't neutral arbiters. They're gatekeepers. The mechanisms are subtle. Peer review determines what research gets published. Grant committees decide what investigations receive funding. Tenure committees evaluate whether a researcher's topics are legitimate. Museum acquisition policies determine what gets preserved. Editorial boards choose which popular histories reach audiences. Are these mechanisms neutral quality control, or do they enforce orthodoxy? Both, probably. Gatekeeping prevents pseudoscience from overwhelming genuine scholarship. It maintains standards, but it also privileges certain interpretations and marginalizes dissent. Continental drift was ridiculed by gatekeepers for decades before evidence became overwhelming. Helicobacter pylori as the cause of ulcers was dismissed as absurd until proof became undeniable. Meteorites falling from the sky were considered peasant superstition until specimens accumulated in numbers institutions couldn't ignore. Numerous now accepted theories were initially suppressed through institutional gatekeeping. So which is the giant question? Legitimate marginalization of weak claims, or institutional rejection of uncomfortable evidence that doesn't fit approved narratives? Consider the power dynamics. Institutional historians are predominantly Western, educated, secular, committed to particular theoretical frameworks. Evolutionary biology, materialist archaeology, uniformitarian geology. These frameworks produce valuable insights, but they also reflect assumptions. Alternative researchers are often outsiders, indigenous historians, religious researchers, independent investigators. They lack institutional credentials and are therefore dismissed regardless of what they observe or argue. Whose knowledge counts? Academic publications outweigh oral tradition. Peer-reviewed archaeology outweighs indigenous testimony. Institutional authority outweighs individual observation, no matter how consistent or widespread. Is this hierarchy justified by superior methodology, or does it maintain power structures that determine what's thinkable? Methodology matters. Not all claims are equally valid. Not all evidence is equally reliable. But methodology itself reflects values and assumptions. It's not neutral ground floating above culture and politics. It's constructed by people with particular worldviews, training, and interests. Decolonizing history might mean taking indigenous testimony seriously rather than treating it as quaint mythology. Questioning whether institutional neutrality actually exists, recognizing that all historical narratives reflect particular perspectives and serve particular purposes. Giants, whether they walked this earth or lived only in human imagination, became a casualty of epistemological gatekeeping. not necessarily through deliberate conspiracy, but through structural mechanisms that determine what counts as legitimate knowledge, what questions are worth asking, what evidence deserves serious investigation. The giant question was decided before evidence was fully examined, not by examining claims on merit, but by determining that people asking the questions lacked proper credentials, used improper methods, or challenged frameworks too fundamental to question, which leaves us with a practical problem. If institutions control what counts as knowledge, and institutions have failed us on this question, what do we do now? You don't have to choose between trusting institutions blindly and believing every conspiracy. You can think for yourself. It's harder, but it works better. Giants represent just one historical mystery where evidence is ambiguous and institutions are unreliable. Ancient civilizations with inexplicable capabilities, consciousness, and the origin of life, archaeological anomalies that don't fit conventional timelines, suppressed historical narratives. The list is long. How do we think about these questions when definitive answers are unavailable and authorities can't be trusted to investigate honestly? Here's a framework. Gather evidence from multiple sources. Evaluate source reliability without automatic deference to authority. Acknowledge uncertainty. Remain open to new evidence. Resist tribal identification with believers or skeptics. Apply the same critical thinking to all claims, including institutional ones. For the giant question, this means practical steps. Read primary sources newspapers, archaeological reports, not just modern summaries. Examine indigenous testimony directly rather than through academic filters. Study both believer and skeptic arguments. Acknowledge gaps in knowledge. Avoid claiming certainty. Remain intellectually humble. The giant controversy shows how genuine institutional opacity breeds conspiracy theories. Authorities won't explain missing specimens, people assume the worst. When museums won't address documented discoveries, suspicion grows. Some of this suspicion becomes conspiracy thinking, coordinated secret plans, shadowy organizations, intentional deception. But distinguish conspiracy from structural suppression. Not every cover-up requires conspiracy. Sometimes truth gets suppressed through ordinary bureaucracy, academic gatekeeping, career incentives and cultural bias, museum curators protecting professional reputations, archaeologists avoiding controversial topics that threaten tenure, publishers rejecting manuscripts that challenge paradigms. No coordination necessary. Just distributed behavior responding to institutional incentives. Maintaining critical thinking without descending into paranoia requires discipline. Focus on documented patterns, not speculation. Distinguish between strong and weak evidence. Avoid assuming coordination when structural explanations suffice. Demand evidence for extraordinary claims, including claims of cover-up. In an era of institutional distrust, how do we seek truth? Neither blind faith in authorities nor conspiracy paranoia works. We need sophisticated critical thinking that evaluates claims based on evidence, while recognizing that institutions have biases, limitations, and sometimes agendas that conflict with truth-seeking. Applied to giants, maybe they existed, maybe they didn't. But the question deserves better than dismissal or credulity. It deserves honest investigation, transparent institutions, accessible evidence, serious scholarship that doesn't prejudge conclusions, which raises one final question. What should we demand from institutions regarding the giant question and similar mysteries? What collective action might force the transparency that individual research cannot? Whether or not giants existed, these questions deserve answers. Asking them isn't conspiracy, it's citizenship. Why do institutions refuse to investigate documented historical claims seriously? Why are indigenous testimonies dismissed when they conflict with establishment narratives? Why is evidence that allegedly existed in institutional collections no longer accessible? Why do certain topics become taboo within academic discourse? What structural incentives drive institutional orthodoxy? How can we ensure future archaeological discoveries are transparently documented and made publicly accessible? These questions matter whether giants walked this earth or not. They're about institutional accountability, epistemological pluralism, historical honesty, the right to ask difficult questions without being dismissed as fringe or foolish. Demanding answers doesn't require believing in giants. It requires believing in transparent institutions and honest investigation. It requires believing that history belongs to everyone, not just credentialed gatekeepers. It requires believing curiosity isn't conspiracy. these questions aren't radical. They're basic, and they deserve answers. What does refusing to ask them cost us in wonder, possibility, and truth? In the end, the giants' greatest trick wasn't hiding their bones. It was making us wonder, and wonder is what makes us human. A world where giants definitively didn't exist is less interesting than a world where the question remains open. Uncertainty creates space for imagination, curiosity, investigation. These are gifts of the human condition. Perhaps the giants' greatest legacy isn't their existence or non-existence. It's the questions they force us to ask about history, institutions, and ourselves. Mystery enriches human experience. A fully explained world is a diminished world. The giants, real or mythological, remind us that history is larger, stranger, more mysterious than institutional narratives admit, that the past refuses to be fully domesticated by modern categories and certainties. Every generation rediscovers ancient mysteries and asks questions anew. Perhaps we'll never know whether giants walked the earth, but the fact that we keep asking across centuries and cultures reveals something essential about the human spirit. We need mystery, we need wonder, we need to imagine that the past holds secrets the present hasn't yet decoded. The giants live in that space between knowing and unknowing, reminding us that history isn't settled, truth isn't certain, and the past still has power to surprise us. Maybe that's enough.